What's good, y'all? Welcome back to the Playmakers Corner podcast. I'm your host for today, Simon Villanos, aka Coach V. We're recording this on July 8th, 2024. This is episode 378, another season preview that I'm bringing you, and the biggest one that I'll drop to date. So feel free to use the timestamps, but this really should be a great episode. We are talking about 3A football. I got 16 teams here I gotta talk about, including the two teams who went to state last year, a couple of newcomers, new faces, and some familiar ones going into this next season here, which should prove to be another banner year for the 3A classification in Colorado. Arguably the best classification, in my opinion, the best classification in Colorado football. It gets real in 3A. And so on this episode, for every team, and we're doing this for all 11-man football teams, but on this episode we're going to talk about every team's past season, so what happened last season, all the storylines and whatnot. Talk about departures, graduating seniors, key players going into this next season, and then we're going to go game by game and predict their season, looking at the schedule currently available on July 8th, and also give them a window of wins. We will be doing this for every single 11-man football team, so make sure you check out the other season previews in case you're curious about other programs here. But we got a lot to talk about this episode, as I will be covering 3A football in the fall as well. By the way, that is the classification I've been assigned, and I will cover them throughout the playoffs, just like I did last year. So I am super excited to get into this. Without further ado, let's talk about our first team here. Alright, so first one on the block, we got Conifer here. Last season, I thought they would go 7-3 with a window of wins between 5 and 8. I felt like they had some key pieces there. And, you know, they came pretty close to my prediction. They finished 6-4, just one game below where I thought they would finish here. I think the one game I got wrong was them losing to Summit 24-10. I thought Wyatt Nichols and company could take over, but it looked like maybe he got hurt or something else happened. Only passed 9 times in that game, which, I mean, it was a 24-10 game in that one. While the opposing quarterback for Summit, Hank Chabot, he passed 27 times. So interesting enough there. But other than that, the rest of their schedule went as I predicted. To start the season, they beat Fort Morgan 18-7. Then they would drop one to a tough Glenwood Springs team 26-8. Then you had that Summit game. But then they bounced back with a win over Eagle Valley 37-6 before losing to a tough Holy Family team 41-6. But then would beat Wheat Ridge 35-0, then lose to a tough Green Mountain team 54-14, but then beat Littleton 56-14, Skyview 52-21, and Evergreen 55-0. But unfortunately for Conifer, it just was not enough to make the playoffs here. And I mean, they did win 6 games, but you look at the quality of those wins, I mean, none of those teams are playoff teams. And then you look at some of the point differentials between them and, you know, playoff teams they played, and it's just a little bit too wide, and so that is probably why they missed out on the playoffs there. But let's talk about some players they are losing, because they lose some good ones. They lose Wyatt Nichols, who was their quarterback last season, only played 4 games where he passed for 231 yards and 3 touchdowns, but they would also lose the quarterback who would replace him in Jackson Kosar, who was a great athlete for them. He would end up playing quarterback for the rest of the season, passed for 467 yards, 8 touchdowns to 4 picks, while rushing for an additional 416 yards and 4 touchdowns. It's a shame we never got to see them play a complete senior season together, as I was really high on that connection. Kosar playing wide receiver before, I believe, but you know, it is what it is. They also lose a big-time star here in Grady Forsyth, the Air Force commit. He had an excellent senior season, rushing for 235 yards and 4 touchdowns, while being their lead receiver at tight end, mind you, with 25 receptions for 401 yards and 9 touchdowns. On defense, he was their lead tackle and sack leader with 64 tackles and 6.5 sacks. He was a very good 3-year varsity starter, and so that's just really tough to replace right there. But altogether, the damage on defense as far as graduation goes, they only graduate 5 of their top 13 tacklers. Offensively, I mean, you lose the guys I just listed there in Nichols, Kosar, and Forsyth, who did make up a big part of that offense. But you do bring back a solid amount here. And so let's go ahead and get into it. Let's talk about the players coming back, starting with incoming senior athlete Karsten Wolonski. He was their lead rusher with 877 yards, 8 touchdowns. Was also their lead tackler, second leading tackler with 58 tackles. I also got to watch him play in the spring against Mile High Prep a number of times there. And, he was a solid contributor with some big dogs out there. And so you got to respect that for sure here. I think he is a tough athlete that Conifer's bringing back, and definitely somebody you can lean on both sides of the football. And I think that's going to translate going into next season. He should take a pretty big step forward, if not have another breakout season or a breakout season for him. So keep an eye on him. But you also bring back another incoming senior running back and their second leading rusher in Carson Pear, who rushed for 672 yards and 7 touchdowns. In my opinion, he does seem to be the more shifty, faster back here. Running for 7.4 yards a carry. He's going to help lead a two-headed rushing attack with Wolonski here. He also contributed 18 tackles on defense, but I think on offense he could definitely be the X weapon there for them and be the game changer when it comes down to it. On top of that, they bring back Ben Metziger. The incoming senior is a 6'2", 290-pound defensive tackle / offensive tackle who had 25 tackles last season. You can look at him to help anchor this offensive line going into 2024. They also bring back Benson White, the 6'3" wide receiver defensive end. Had 46 tackles and a pick last season. Going into this next season, he could be a bigger part of this defense, or should be a bigger part of this defense, and honestly a potential defensive playmaker of the year candidate. He does a lot for them over there, so keep an eye on him. And then I do want to shout out this player here, Abigail Liddell here, first female football player at Conifer, will be a sophomore after playing JV last season. So just an interesting story that I wanted to throw out there. But as you can see, Conifer returns a lot here. The majority of their defense, a good core here in the rushing attack between some key linemen and two of their top rushers who were very productive last season, as they will be leaned on more going into this next season. But let's go ahead and get into predictions here, as they do play in the 3A classification, which is extremely tough here. And so to start, they play Standley Lake, who we'll talk about later on in this episode, but we'll be moving down to 3A. I honestly think it could go either way, but I'm going to say it is a loss here. Standley Lake has always been a tough team, right? And they got a stud of their own over there. If they could stop Graham, then they have a chance, right? But you got to keep in mind this was a defense that did struggle at times when you saw them play against, playoff caliber type teams. That margin of error and, that point difference was pretty big. And, Standley Lake is a team that I think can go to the playoffs here in 3A, as, they were fringe playoff teams in 4A. So I just think that this is a tough game, especially at the beginning of the season. They haven't played a team with a guy like Liam Graham specifically in a little bit, and so I think that's going to be a loss, but it could go either way if they could stop Liam Graham. That's the big key there. We'll see. Then they play Devlin here. Devlin, they have a high-powered passing attack. It's going to be difficult to stop, but definitely not impossible. I think they actually match up pretty well here, and you also got to keep in mind Devlin is losing their head coach as well, who's going to one of the teams that we're going to talk about later on in this episode. I think Conifer can control the ball here, control the pace of the game, and this is definitely a winnable game for them here, as they do have a little bit more size as well. But then they play George Washington. I think this could be a close game, but George Washington has a promising young quarterback in Hayes Dwyer, as well as some offensive linemen and whatnot. I think this is kind of a tough ask out of them. Also, they bring back some great running backs too. I think that's a lot of firepower for Conifer to stop. I don't know if their defense is like that, and honestly, I don't know if their offense can keep up, because you do got to keep in mind they're replacing their quarterback. So that's a whole dimension of the offense that you just got to figure out. And against a team like G-Dub, who could pretty much do it all over there, I don't know if I love that shootout. But then they play Eagle Valley. That should be a dub. They play Glenwood Springs after. I think that could be a closer game for sure, as they do lose Joaquin Sandoval. But I'm going to call that a loss for now, as I do like who they bring back to stop the run, and I'm just going to assume that Conifer is going to lean on the run, and so I don't love that matchup right away. But then they play Skyview, that should be a win. Following that, they play Wheat Ridge. This should definitely be a much closer game here, and could go Wheat Ridge's way, but Conifer is the more, I'd say, consistent program here, while Wheat Ridge is on the rise. For now, I'm going to call that a dub for Conifer, but that really could go either way. Then they play Summit. Summit is very inexperienced here, and they are going to rely on a quarterback for their offense. Now, they do play them at the end of the season, so they could have figured it out by this time in the year, but I'm going to call that a dub for Conifer. That's still a tough one, though. I'm not going to lie. That could be, I don't know. That could be a surprise game. That could keep them out of the playoffs if they don't win. So there you go. Then they play Green Mountain. That Green Mountain's losing some players and a coach, but they return some tough linebackers and some great defensive players and offensive players. They're still going to be tough. I think that's a loss for now. Evergreen, though, should be a dub at the end of the season. And so altogether, I have Conifer going 6-4 with a window of wins between 4 and 7. Look, Conifer has always been a stable program, and they found ways to win with who they've had in the past here, even when losing a lot of talent. This year, though, I do think they have a very solid squad with some tough backs and the majority of that defense returning, who you could really only hope to take a step forward. If they don't, I don't know, but they do have a pretty tough schedule here. Standley Lake and Devlin are two of the tougher out-of-conference schedules. Winning both of those would definitely help their playoff chances a lot. And then I think the Glenwood Springs game is a very winnable game here that could put them in the playoffs if they win it. But that is a tough squad to play at Glenwood Springs too, by the way. So I just don't know about that one. But either way, I have them going 6-4 with a window of wins between 4 and 7. I do think they can win 7 games. If they win 7 games, I think they're all but guaranteed a spot in the playoffs for sure. Just plain and simple, right? Looking at strength of schedule, but it can't be another thing like last season where you're beating the teams you should be, and then that point margin with teams that are considered playoff teams by us and by RPI and whatnot. You can't be losing to those teams by 40. You just can't. And so hopefully that gap lessens here and they can make the playoffs. But, 3A is tough. It's cutthroat. They're going to have to find a way outside of what they have now to get it done. Players have to improve, plain and simple. Now, up next, we are going to talk about Evergreen. And, last season, I predicted them to go 5-5 with the window of wins between 4 and 7. I trusted their process over there, even though they were losing some great players in a Tommy Paholski and Russ Woodward. But they just go a disappointing 2-8 season. It is their worst record that they've posted since we have started this podcast here. By the way, window of wins, I had them at 4 and 7, so they were even outside of that window of wins here. And, it just wasn't a good season, plain and simple here. I mean, just going down the line, they would start on a pretty bad 6-game losing streak. And most of these were blowouts, really. But they'd lose to Northridge 48-6. Eagle Valley, they got beat by 26-7. Discovery Canyon 42-14. Severance 41-8. Palisade 38-0. Green Mountain 55-3. Now, that is a tough group of teams there, Green Mountain and DCC making the playoffs, and I want to say Palisade as well, but the rest were fringe playoff teams. Still, though, that's just tough. Then they do beat Littleton 29-7 and Skyview 25-6 before getting blown out by Wheat Ridge 35-14 and Conifer 55-0 here. Just not a lot of upsides for them, just plain and simple. Now, they were a very young team, only graduated 2 of their top 13 tacklers, and honestly, there were only 5 seniors on this roster alone, so you bring back the majority of your team, but the seniors you are losing, like I said, 2 of your top 13 tacklers, but you also lose a guy like Garrison Wiggins, who started at quarterback, but had a pretty horrible season, throwing for 478 yards, 1 touchdown to 9 interceptions. He was eventually replaced as his passing attempts went down. Did have 16 tackles and 2 picks on defense. They also lose Zach Gillings, their defensive lineman, who had 26 tackles. So those were their key players, seniors that they were graduating. But going into 2024, at least you could hope for more, as you do bring back a lot, including Josh Bittner, who ended up being their lead rusher with 223 rushing yards and 5 touchdowns, but started out at receiver where he was their lead receiver with 25 receptions for 288 yards and 3 touchdowns. They went to Bittner as a running back in their last 2 games, and it seemed to work because he scored 5 rushing touchdowns in those 2 games. This may be where he needs to go in order to stabilize his offense that just needs an identity. On top of that, on defense, he's going to be an incoming senior who brings 84 tackles and a team high 4 picks at corner. He's a great athlete for Evergreen. He's definitely a next level guy. And so you could find ways to build around him. But it is definitely going to be tough because you got to fill out the rest. But here's some other players that I think could step up here, including Cademan Ferris Haddad. Excuse me if I'm saying that wrong, but the 6', 220-pound incoming senior linebacker was their lead tackler with 130 tackles, 15.5 tackles for loss, and 3 sacks. He returns with an experienced defense. You kind of just hope that him and the defense take a step forward. They also bring back Hudson Stebner, the 6'3", 240-pound-ish lineman, returns here. He had 64 tackles and 7 tackles for loss. He should help out this defense. And then they bring back Jackson Post. The incoming sophomore is a 6'4", 190-pound defensive end, definitely light, but he had a solid freshman year with 45 tackles, 10.5 tackles for loss, and a team high 7.5 sacks. He's going to be another key contributor to this defense. So for Evergreen, they have an experienced defense with some size, and they have a star in Josh Bittner, who's going to play offense and defense. He's just going to have to. But you have some pieces to work with here. Let's talk about this next season, starting with Battle Mountain, who I'm just going to assume will have a varsity squad. I think they beat them for sure if they play Battle Mountain. Then they play Montbello. That's a team that's new to varsity football but has been around, on the JV level. They're a 4A team. They have a lot of size up front and some excellent athletes. I think that's a loss, just straight up. Then they play George Washington. I think that's another loss. I don't know how great this defense is going to fare against a Hayes Dwyer and an offensive line that has some size up front. So I just don't love if that becomes a shootout, because I don't think this Evergreen defense is going to be exactly locked down, at least at the start of the season. Then they play Basalt. That really should be a dub there. Severance, I think, is a tough team. Really what it comes down to is whether you think this defense could stop Ian Pennick and that squad over there that is losing a lot, including a Jeremiah Hoffman and his brother Jaden Hoffman, who was their quarterback. I'm calling this a loss, though, because I do like this Severance defense, who has always been good. They bring back some good defensive players over there who, if you only have one star on offense or one big-time contributor, that's something that they could take care of. Then they play Summit here. I think that's a dub. They just don't bring back enough, and I'll talk about them later on in this episode. Skyview should also be a dub. Green Mountain, unfortunately, I think is still a loss. They have a lot of good players coming back. Wheat Ridge, I think, is a loss. Same deal like Green Mountain. And Conifer, I think, is a loss. Those 3 teams, I think, are playoff teams. I don't think Evergreen is that yet, at least on paper right now. So right now, I have them going 4-6, but I do give them a window of wins between 3 and 7 here. Look, this team is a relatively talented squad, but it doesn't mean anything if they can't get more stability and more production out of their offense. It seemed like they found something at the end of last year with running the ball with Bittner, but in 3A you cannot get away with just one offensive option and being one-dimensional over there. Other players need to step up for Evergreen to have a winning record, just plain and simple. The defense either has to be top 15 or their offense, you got to have multiple players take a step forward. Either way, that is a lot to ask there when you start saying this many ifs. So with that being said, we'll just have to see what happens for Evergreen moving forward. Alright, now up next we have a juggernaut in Green Mountain. Last season I expected a contending year from them, and I predicted them to go undefeated, 10-0, as I felt like they had so much more size than everyone else in the state and just a much more physical team on paper, and that's exactly what they did here. Still looking at the regular season, though, let's go down the line. They would blow out Golden, a 4A playoff team, 36-0. Beat Severance 28-6, Mountain View 49-0, Pueblo South 50-0, Mead 44-7, Evergreen 55-3, Conifer 54-14, Wheat Ridge 50-0, Littleton 58-0, Skyview 16-9-0 to end the season, as they did not have a close game all season here, just blowing out everybody and proving to be one of the best teams in the state here, regardless of classification, and they were the 1 seed in the playoffs, I believe, here. But in the playoffs, they would go ahead and play Glenwood Springs, who they would blow out 52-7. Then they'd play Roosevelt next. Cody actually went to this game. This was their first real closer game of the season. It started out as close, and then they pulled away here, but they still beat them 40-21. And then they played Lutheran here, who Lutheran played their best game of the season, and I felt like Green Mountain played an excellent game here. And this was an instant classic here, one of the greatest games I've ever watched. And I unfortunately wasn't able to attend, but I was able to watch over live stream later. And oh my goodness, what a classic here. Lutheran would beat them 27-21, as Green Mountain did get a chance to score at the end, but would just come up short in the red zone here. And so Green Mountain, they were a team that I was pretty set on winning state at some point, but unfortunately, it just did not go down that way, as they lost to Lutheran, who obviously went to state after this. And I feel like Lutheran prepared so much for Green Mountain that they just underestimated Holy Family, in my opinion. And they just did not come out to play the same way as they played at Green Mountain. And that was just such a vicious game in the trenches, on the field in general. It was a cold one too, and so that's a tough game for sure. But Green Mountain still having a great season here. Now, let's talk about some departures here. First off, they lose their head coach, Jesse German, who won Coach of the Year and did an excellent job here. Since 2018 with Green Mountain, he accumulated a 52-17 record. That also includes 12 win seasons in 2022 and 2023, where they obviously won league both those years and were extremely dominant. Look, this Green Mountain team was a bully and juggernaut these last couple years, and losing their head coach is tough, who was able to transform this program. On top of that, they lose players like Blake Westland, who was an all-PMC linebacker and MVP contender for us last season. In his senior year at quarterback, he passed for 1,163 yards, 19 touchdowns, only 2 picks, while rushing for 653 yards and 11 touchdowns in a run-heavy offense, mind you, so doing a great job there. But on defense, had 79 tackles and 5 interceptions as their lead tackler, rusher, and passer. I don't know how many players you're going to see do that, but, he led a championship-worthy team with a championship-worthy performance, but unfortunately just fell short to Lutheran. In that game, it wasn't like he struggled passing. He did a good job making some big plays through the air there, so you love to see that. They also graduate Austin Contreras, who was an all-PMC edge rusher and a top 5 senior edge rusher in the state, actually, for us. He accumulated 71 tackles and 8 sacks, causing 4 fumbles. He was just a beast for them off the edge and has been a mainstay of this defense forever. He held down that outside and did a great job for them, and was just very difficult to play against. They also lose Austin Beeson, who I believe was a 3-year starter. He was tied for their leader in interceptions with 5 at corner. Also had 78 tackles. He was their lead receiver with 10 receptions for 273 yards and 4 touchdowns. He's just another great athlete they'll miss. They also graduate all PMC linemen in Colton Patterson and David Ives, who are great. On defense, including Contreras and Beeson and Westland, they graduate 9 of their top 13 tacklers, so the majority of that defense. And then offensively, they lose the majority of their contributors. They had 9 players with over 150 yards rushing last season. 7 of those 9 players graduate. That includes Dakers, Polanat, George Soppy, Choin, excuse me if I'm saying that wrong, and Kaganbrink and Bourne, as they're all big-time rushers there, in addition to a Blake Westland out there. So, Green Mountain's losing a lot. right? I don't think there's any doubt about that. But they do return some solid talent, believe it or not, as well. Let's start with their head coach, though, Anthony Rankin. He's coming over from Devlin, which was a team that was consistently a top passing offense, not only in 2A, but in the entire state. And so he's an offensive mind, a little bit more different from German, who I feel like was more of a defensive guy. But, Rankin knows how to coach over there. And, he's coached some great teams, Devlin teams in the past. So I think this is a good fit overall. On top of that, defensively, they bring back some dogs here in Drennan Dowell, the 5'11", 215-pound incoming senior linebacker, had 61 tackles and 8 tackles for loss. Going into his senior year, he has to be one of the players to step up in the absence of a super talented class of 24 squad, especially on the defensive side. But next to him, he brings back Hudson Burke, who's a senior as well, 5'11", 220. He had 51 tackles, 2 sacks, 1 pick last year. He's expected to lead a tough defense. Both of those guys are thumpers. They love to hit. They're physical. They're going to do a great job against the run, and I think that'll set the tone for this team. Now on defense, they also bring back Demetrius Padilla as an incoming senior here. He's going to contribute on defense, but he was also the top returning rusher coming back from last season. He had 217 yards and 3 touchdowns on only 25 carries. While the system is going to change, I assume, he's still one of their top athletes, a very explosive and just shifty athlete for them. He's going to get a larger role and could be due for a breakout season for them. And so that's a very important athlete on offense to be bringing back, as I think he could be an OPOY candidate potentially. They also bring back Andreas Gilroy here, the 6'5", 265-pound offensive tackle. Is a little lighter, undersized, but he has been a starter for them these last couple of years and is a tough lineman that should help with all the departures from last season. So they still bring back some size in a premier tackle coming back here. They also bring back Corbin Wade, the 6'4", 215-pound defensive end / quarterback. Had snaps at QB, rushing for only 102 yards and 2 touchdowns, but he's going to be an incoming senior and is one of those returners on this offense, along with Padilla and a Dax Gomez. Gomez looking to be their wideout one moving forward. But Corbin Wade, he's a great athlete at edge rusher, but he could be a potentially very interesting quarterback prospect. We'll see what happens here. So, Green Mountain, they lose a lot, but they do hire one of the best coaches they could possibly hire here, in my opinion, to replace Jesse German. And they bring back some tough linebackers and some great athletes who, with the right coach, you can make it work, and I think he is one of the better coaches who can make this work. But they do play a very difficult schedule here, starting with Windsor, who will be moving down to 3A, but was a tough 4A playoff team. I think that's a loss. Windsor has a lot of size up front. Green Mountain, they have some size, but a lot of it's inexperience. I don't love that matchup just to start in the trenches, and so I think that's a loss. Not to mention Windsor brings back a lot of weapons as well. Then they played Dakota Ridge. That's another team with a lot of size up front, especially on that offensive line. Well, they do lose some key players like Blake Palladino. They bring back some great running backs in a Sam Callis and a Landon Cowsbeck. That is going to be a very good test, I think, for this defense, but I don't know if stopping them on defense is going to be enough there, as I just don't know how this offense is going to look. So I think that's a loss. There's just, those 2 first games, they're playing 4A playoff teams, and there's just some significant size differences and experience differences up front. That has to be an issue, especially early on. Then they play Pomona, 5A team moving down to 3A. I honestly think that's a dub there. Their linebackers should take care of that offense. That didn't do much last season. I'm just don't have a lot of faith in Pomona here, as Green Mountain, I feel like, has been the more stable program over them the last couple of seasons. So I just got to go with them, even with the coaching change. Then they play Northridge. I think that's a win there. They lose a lot, and we'll talk about them later on in this episode, but I just like the defense going up against that offense right now. Then they play Lutheran. I've been going back and forth here. I'm actually here. I'm going to just be honest. I think that's a loss. Lutheran is losing a lot. Just being real, they're losing a lot. but they bring back an offensive line. They bring back all the running backs who, like, some of them were hurt last season. Like Sawyer Wald didn't even play in that playoff game, and that's a pretty significant loss there. And so I just don't love that matchup. Plus, Lutheran isn't losing their head coach, so I think that's a loss, but it could go either way. You know, it is midseason by that point. You play 4 tough teams. It could go either way, you know, but I think that's just a loss right there, though. Then they play Wheat Ridge. That should be a dub. It's going to be a tough one, though. You know, it's going to be a tough one, but I think you could beat them if you're Green Mountain. Could go either way, but then they play Summit, Evergreen, Conifer, Skyview. You know, I think Evergreen and Conifer could potentially be an issue, but I really think those are dubs. They should win their league at the very least. And so right now I have them going 7-3 with a window of wins between 5 and 9. Look, they scheduled an incredibly tough out of conference schedule, which includes 3 teams who are higher classifications or played in higher classifications last season in Windsor, Dakota Ridge, and Pomona. 2 of those teams in Windsor and Dakota Ridge made the playoffs and got past the first round. On top of that, they scheduled perennial playoff teams in Northridge and Lutheran. Luckily enough, I don't think their conference is that strong, and that at their worst is their ticket to the playoffs. If they win their conference, they make the playoffs, right? But, you know, there is a world where Green Mountain catches fire again and makes a deep playoff run. Say they win a couple of these games, like say they beat a Windsor or Dakota Ridge, and then they knock off Northridge and Lutheran potentially. They could be rolling here. I mean, none of these teams in their league, I think, are really going to, like, I don't know. They could maybe lose one of those games, but I don't know if they lose more than one of those league games. But if they do that and they're rolling, you know, they could go into the playoffs as a low-key dark horse team. Maybe not the contender they were these last 2 seasons, but a dark horse for sure with some tough defenders and some athletes all around. So Green Mountain's going to be a very interesting team. I think you could still expect them to make the playoffs, but their out-of-conference schedule will give us a better idea of who they really are and what the ceiling is like in 2024. Now, up next, we have Littleton here. Last season, predicted them to go 3-6 with a window of wins between 2 and 5. And, you know, they finished below that, below expectations at 1-9 here. Just a really tough season, so let me just go down the schedule from last year. First, they lost to Sierra 26-18. That's a winnable game, especially considering they didn't have Michael Lumpkin in that one. They will then lose a tough triple overtime game to Arvada. Cody was at this game. If it goes into triple overtime, there are plenty of ways to win that game, plenty of opportunities. But then they bounce back and beat Alameda 46-14. That's not necessarily unexpected. But then they lose to Englewood 29-6, Kennedy 42-27, Skyview 28-6, Evergreen 29-7, Conifer 56-14, Green Mountain 58-0, and Wheat Ridge 57-22. So just a really tough go for them. And on top of that, they do lose some seniors. Now their stats are incomplete, so hopefully that is fixed going into next season. But according to what I do have, they lose 8 of their top 13 tacklers, including some key players like Nashawn Harrison, their 6'4", 220-pound defensive end, at 31 tackles and 1 sack, you know, as of now, what is listed there. They also lose Colton Gerber, who is their lead tackler with 122 tackles. And then they also lose Ryan Braun. He was an exceptional center for them. And on defense, he had 26 tackles. So you lose some big size up front here for sure. And a lot of your defense. That definitely makes me nervous going into next season. But you do bring back some players, including Chase Pruitt, who just needs to stay healthy. Last season, played only 3 games. And those 3 games were their closest games of the season, you know. At least I believe they were their closest games of the season, where he rushed for 377 yards and 2 touchdowns, and, you know, was just a big-time producer for them, while also having 11 tackles and a pick on defense. Going into his junior year, he needs to have a healthy, consistent season. And I think if he does, he has a breakout season, plain and simple there. And Littleton just does better. They're better with him on the field. So if he's there, they should improve at the very least. But they also bring back Sam Byers, their quarterback, threw for 353 yards, 7 touchdowns to 4 picks, also rushed for a touchdown. If Littleton has hope to improve, he has to take a step forward, and then I think if he does do that, they have a chance of winning a couple more games. And then they also bring back Omani Johnson, their 6'4", 180-pound corner, who had 12 tackles and 4 picks in the games they had stats for. He was a big part of this young group and will be one of their few incoming seniors coming in. So they got some players for sure, but they still got to put it together. You got to remember this is also a relatively new coaching staff as they enter their second year. But it's going to take a lot for them to significantly improve here. Let's look at their schedule here for 2024. To start, they play Kansas City. In my opinion, that's a tough team. They have 2 big defensive ends over there. Considering this team lost a lot of size, I don't love that matchup for them. Then they play Jefferson. I think that's a dub right there. Then they play Englewood. This could be a win, honestly. They graduate a lot. They also lose their head coach and quarterback. It's a winnable game, but I'm just going to go play it safe and call it a loss. Following that, they play Eagle Valley. I'll preview this team here next week, but I do think that's a loss. They got some nice returning players, and I do like what their coaching staff is starting over there. Denver North, I think, is a loss. Holy Family is a loss. Standley Lake is a loss. Kennedy, I really think is a winnable game, but they got some pieces over there. So, don't be surprised if they lose this one too. They got some solid defensive players and some offensive players, so give them some time. But I am going to call it a win for now. Lutheran, I think they lose, and then they beat Hinckley for sure. So, altogether, I have Littleton going 3-7 with a window of wins between 1 and 4. Look, this team was on the struggle bus last season after having a really solid, group of players just graduate, which is always tough to replace. But this season will depend a lot on Pruitt and how healthy he could be, because he has been one of the bright spots for them. If he's healthy, then I think everyone benefits around him, and this team can easily win 3 games. We'll see what happens here, because even then, other players need to step up for them to, win those 3 games for sure. Even then, like I said, 3A is not easy. So we'll see what happens here, but it should be an exciting season. All right, now up next, we're going to talk about Lutheran here. This team was a team I was really high on last season, and I had them going 9-1 with a window of wins between 7 and 10. And, in the regular season, they didn't do too bad. They finished 8-2, just 1 game below where I thought they would be. I believe, just looking at this record, the only game that I got wrong prediction-wise was that Holy Family game, 35-28, which was a close one at Holy Family. Cody went to that one. It was a good game for sure, and maybe a preview of the state championship. That's what we thought at the time, which would end up being true. But the rest of the regular season went as expected. Blew out Lutheran 56-6. Out-of-state Lutheran, that is. Beat Mead 35-15, Discovery Canyon 45-14, Pueblo East in a close one 26-21, lost to Montrose as expected 36-14. Couldn't bounce back with the win over Holy Family, but would blow out Lincoln after that 68-0, Northfield 32-20, Kennedy 49-0, Fort Morgan 35-6 on their way to make the playoffs. In the playoffs, I saw their first-round matchup against Frederick, which ended up being a shootout here, but they would end up pulling away, winning 66-37 in a big-time shootout there. They would then travel down to Durango, which for the second year in a row, they would beat them in Durango and win 39-30 in a close one, but enough to move on to the next round where they faced off with the 1 seed in Green Mountain, and what ended up being an instant classic, which I talked about earlier on in this episode. They would emerge victorious, arguably playing one of their best games of the season, just absolutely gutting this one out and winning 27-21 to make it to the state championship, where unfortunately they just could not get it done against Holy Family. Came out a little flat. On top of that, was definitely struggling with some injuries as well, as it finally caught up to them as they lost 33-8 in a tough one. Still a successful season for Lutheran. 2 state championship appearances in a row. That's definitely tough to digest if you're a Lutheran fan or if you're a player on the team. That's a tough way to go, but still better than most endings to most teams in the country. To go to state 2 years in a row and have that opportunity, you want to take advantage of that, but that's a tough opportunity to come by once, nonetheless twice. So with that being said, they do graduate a very exceptional class of 2024. Let's talk about it. Starting with all PMC offensive tackle Colin Sturm, he'll be gone. Landon Moshek, I feel like I keep saying that wrong, but he was an all PMC DT. He had 89 tackles, 24 tackles for loss, and 7 sacks. He's gone. Mason Kelly, all PMC corner, 72 tackles, 7 picks to go with 14 pass deflections. He's graduated. Peyton Garrett, who was a watchlist edge rusher and had a breakout season last season, going for 87 tackles, 26 tackles for loss, 10 sacks, and 18 hurries. He is now at Northern Colorado. He was their leader in sacks and was an exceptional player. He's now graduated. Sam Smolin, the senior, was a watchlist safety who had 84 tackles and 6 picks. He's graduated. Ryan Composey, their 6'3", 270-pound lineman, had 54 tackles, 19 tackles for loss, and 3.5 sacks. Gone. Ryken Doggard, their 2-year varsity starter. In both seasons he started, he went to state, and he had a solid year, throwing for 2,607 yards, 32 touchdowns to 13 picks while rushing for 642 yards and 6 touchdowns. I thought he was a very good system quarterback here, played in the system extremely well. Unfortunately, just not good enough to win state those 2 years, but still good enough to get him there. He's now graduated. They also lose Joe Cicio, who's at Northern Colorado. Unfortunately, his season ended very early due to injury, and so they had to replace him, and he has now graduated. Ben Herbeck was going to be an incoming senior, but has now transferred to Valor Christian. He ended up stepping up and was their lead receiver with 1,305 yards, 17 touchdowns on 90 receptions. But like I said, he'll be moving on. That's a pretty devastating blow. You also have many other contributors here, just so many to list, like Cole Johnson, Keaton Raymond, who are graduating as well. They're losing so much offensive talent. I believe they're losing their quarterback as well as their lead receiver, and the majority of this defense, 9 of their top 13 tacklers are now graduated. So they graduate one of the greatest classes this program has probably ever seen here. But, just because they graduate all those players doesn't mean they don't have players over there. This is a team that has reloaded fast in the past, and I think this season should prove to be the same. Let's talk about these contributors here, starting with the running back, Sawyer Wald. He will be an incoming senior, and he got hurt, I think, in their first playoff game versus Frederick, but he still had 1,013 rushing yards and 10 touchdowns on a very productive season here against the eventual champs and Holy Family. Earlier on in the regular season, he ran for 217 yards and a touchdown. That obviously would have helped a lot at state. I felt like there were just times, that offense kind of just sputtered as they were having to resort to their third string running back at times. And it was just tough. And, they also bring back that running back who got those opportunities in the place of Sawyer Wald and some of those injuries, as they do bring back Evan Holdridge, who will only be a sophomore coming back. And his playing time was due to a lot of injuries, but he was productive in his time, rushing for 668 yards and 3 touchdowns, including a 141-yard performance against Durango in the playoffs. That says a lot for a freshman to do that in the playoffs, and says a lot about his potential for sure here. And, he was able to do some things against Holy Family, but it just wasn't enough. Now he's going to be bigger. He's going to be stronger. He's now going to be a sophomore, closer to a high school player than a middle school player. And I think that's going to be tough to stop. The Wald and Holdridge backfield is going to be extremely tough for Lutheran, especially when you consider some of the linemen they bring back, as they pretty much bring back their whole offensive line, led by guys like Thomas Green, who will be a senior lineman. He's 6'4", 320. Last year had 25 tackles and 2 tackles for loss on defense, but I think we'll play both sides of the ball. He'll be coming back. You also bring back players like Caleb Abramson, Dane McGuckin, Alex Zackham, their big, tall offensive tackle as well. They return as one of the biggest offensive lines in the state still. And that's going to be an issue for sure. Lutheran, they actually platooned offensive linemen or linemen in general for the most part. So offense was different from defense. So these guys are pretty fresh too. So that's going to be pretty tough. Now on the defensive side, they do bring back some players. Green is one of them. They also bring back Xavier Villarreal. The incoming junior linebacker actually co-led in tackles with 103 tackles and 16 tackles for loss. He's going to be leading a young defense, but he does bring back some good production and leadership. Could be due for a big junior year. They also bring back Gavin Downing, their 6'2", 180-pound corner. He will be a senior and is one of the few returners on the defense. His size and athleticism is going to be very difficult for a lot of opposing receivers who will just struggle against a guy like Downing here, who is a shutdown corner, a very aggressive corner for them. And so I'm really excited for this next season, as he should have a good one. So you have some good contributors on defense coming back, and this is historically a squad that has reloaded on the defensive side very well. And then on top of that, you bring back a very interesting athlete in Jack Waslowski. The 6'3", 200-pound athlete will be an incoming senior, but last season he was their second lead receiver with 556 yards and 5 touchdowns. He came up big in the playoffs multiple times here against Frederick. I think Green Mountain, he had a big game. Against Holy Family, he got some looks there. Didn't play his best game, but he got some looks there for sure. He is extremely capable of being their wideout one at 6'3", 200, but I believe he was also their backup quarterback, and it does appear that he could be in line to play quarterback for them this season. He's a good athlete. He could run the ball. Looked at some of his throwing highlights and whatnot. He could throw the ball pretty well as well in timing. He knows the system, playing a wide receiver and whatnot. This could be a very good stopgap quarterback to have for them, especially considering the line they bring back, the running backs they bring back. If they plug him in there, I definitely would not be mad. But if they go with a young quarterback, then, at least they have a 6'3" receiver to throw to, as well as a strong line and 2 good running backs to lean on. So, if you're Lutheran, even though you lose a lot, you probably don't feel as good about this season as you did this time last year, but you still feel like you got a shot. And, I've been a very notorious Lutheran supporter here. I love what Coach Robbins does over there. There's a reason they are still very successful. And so you still feel good if you're Lutheran. You got pieces, you got to trust this coaching staff to develop players, to get them in the right positions and, use them. Because last season, you saw how many players dropped due to injuries and how many stepped up and did a solid job. They still went to state, and they were competitive in that first quarter, it felt like, at the very least. So if you're Lutheran, you're not really panicking that much here, but let's talk about this 2024 season, as they do play a relatively tough schedule here, starting with an away game to Cooper. They're going to the Woodlands here in Texas. Cooper, they are part of the private school prep league not prep league, but like private school league in Texas. Texas has like a whole classification, I believe, mostly for those private schools. Now, in my opinion, do I think they are better than the public schools? They're not Westlake or Lake Travis or, I'm biased, by the way, or Allen or any of those teams, Duncanville, but they're a good team. They're still good football, right? Any Texas team that you're playing is good football, especially when you're considering this is a team that were champs just a couple years ago. And so this honestly could be nightmare matchup for Lutheran, as they are putting together their defense. They haven't had a lot of experience at the quarterback spot. This could definitely be a loss, but Lutheran does have the size advantage, I think, and some weapons. Wouldn't be surprised if they lose this one, especially because it's an away game, but I am just going to go ahead and say they win it. I do like the size up front. I think that's going to be a significant game changer in this game if they win it. So there you go. But then they come back home and they play Fort Morgan. That should be a dub. Should definitely be closer. I don't think it will be a blowout here. And it really could be a trap game. But I think you find a way to beat them. Then they play Pueblo West here, a 4A team at Pueblo West, by the way. I think this could really go either way depending on where the defense is, though. Pueblo West, I mean, they have weapons, but I don't think they utilize them to their full advantage. They have a dual threat quarterback who I think is tough to stop. I think he's very similar to what Gavin Ishmael was, who they played against in the playoffs last season. And so they kind of know how to do it, but as well, I mean, Ishmael kind of did his thing against them, and you also lose a lot of those defensive players who played against him last season. It could be winnable, and I also think Lutheran's line is way bigger than Pueblo West's like front seven and Pueblo West's offensive line too, but I think this is a loss. Gavin Lockett, that's something that's tough to stop. If they finally figure it out, then maybe they try to get Brock Keck involved. They're 6'5", tight end / wide receiver. That could prove to be interesting as well. This is going to be a very interesting game for sure here. But I'm going to go with Pueblo West because they are the home team in this one. Then they play Res Christian at home. They should be able to beat them. Res Christian, they're not a pushover at all. They're a quality team. I think that's a dub. Then they play Green Mountain at Green Mountain, a matchup here. Green Mountain is losing some players too. They also have a new head coach, and I think that does make the difference. I'm giving this one to Lutheran, but it could be a tough game that goes either way. Then they start some league play here, I believe, as they play Standley Lake, who has Liam Graham, but I don't think that should be enough to beat Lutheran. They play Hinckley, that should be a dub. Holy Family, that should be a dub, but it could go either way. They are replacing a quarterback, but by October 25th, they could be rolling. And so I'm not going to rule it out, but they do play them at home. Last year's matchup, when they were fully healthy, it was a close one in the regular season. Obviously, State was a whole different story with those injuries. And so I'm going to call this one a dub for Lutheran, but don't be surprised if Holy Family wins again at home, just at the end of the season. Then you have Littleton and Kennedy. They should win both of those. As of right now, I have them going 9-1, but I give them a window of wins between 7 and 10 because I could really see them winning 7 games, which will still be enough to get them into the playoffs. But I mean, Pueblo West is going to be tough to beat. Green Mountain, Holy Family, those are all tough teams that are going to be really hard to beat. Not to mention Cooper as well, an out-of-state Texas team that could be tough. But Lutheran, they've been consistently good under head coach Stephen Robbins. They have had only 2 losing seasons under him, and the last time that happened was 2018 and 2017. Other than that, they have won a lot, have had a lot of success, and I think this season they should see a lot of that still. They have a lot of size on the offensive line with 2 very good running backs. On top of that, they have some good players on defense and really good athletes to work with, like a Jack Weslowski here to work with. This Lutheran team may be losing a lot, but there's proven talent on this team that makes a run at state not impossible. I think it's pretty much guaranteed. I'd be surprised if they didn't make the playoffs here, but I would say that they could still contend for a state championship if they wanted to. You do have to coach a lot harder, I feel like, and make some pretty big adjustments here, and then just hope everyone stays healthy down the line. But it's definitely a doable goal if you are Lutheran. Okay, now up next, we're going to talk about Standley Lake. Last season, Cody predicted them to go 3-7 with a window of wins between 2 and 5, and they did do one game better, going 4-6. Here's how it went down back in 2023. They started with a loss to Monarch 28-12, but bounced back with a tough 42-28 dub over Skyline. Then they beat 5A Westminster 34-29. That Westminster squad was on a roll then, so that was a big time win for Standley Lake. They then blew out North Glen 46-12 before losing to Thomas Jefferson 37-7, but bounced back with a big win on the road 14-12 over Grand Junction, before getting blown out by Golden 46-6 and then forfeiting a game to Heritage. And then they would then play Bear Creek and lose to them only 19-0 before getting blown out by Dakota Ridge 49-6 in kind of a shocking turn of events here. Standley Lake would make the playoffs in 4A despite having a forfeit to Heritage, and getting blown out in a lot of these games. That Westminster game going a long way for them. They would go into the first round and play Thomas Jefferson again here and lose just barely to them 22-14. So not a bad season for them in 4A, but they do move down to 3A where things will get interesting. But before I talk about that, let me talk about some players that are graduating, including Braden Smith. He was a 2-year starter for them. He threw for 378 yards, 2 touchdowns to 6 picks, while rushing for 451 yards and 5 touchdowns. Also was a top tackler with 69. They also lose Dorsey Satterfield. He was their lead receiver with 10 receptions for 163 yards and a touchdown. Was also one of their lead tacklers with 58 and 3 interceptions. Altogether, Standley Lake isn't losing the most on offense or defense. I mean, they're a run-heavy team, so quarterback doesn't matter as much, but they are losing a producer there. They do graduate 5 of their top 13 tacklers on defense, though, and 3 of them are in their top 5 in tackling last season, so there's some leadership loss there, but they do return the wide majority. Now they return an absolute star, an incoming senior running back, Liam Graham. He's been the engine to this offense for a while now. Last season, he rushed for 1,192 yards and 12 touchdowns while getting 44 tackles, 1 pick, and 3 pass deflections at corner. He is easily one of the fastest players in the entire state of Colorado, and he could really go to work on this 3A level here, having rushed against some pretty tough defenses. And so he's going to be the mainstay of this squad. They also bring back Boston Harris, who looks to be the next quarterback as a senior for this team. He had some solid performances, throwing for 204 yards while rushing for 162 and 2 touchdowns. 2 passing touchdowns were thrown as well last season. So there you go there. And that does include a 47-yard passing yards, and 1 touchdown pass and a 50 rushing yard, 1 touchdown performance against Thomas Jefferson in the playoffs. Also had 49 tackles and 2 picks on defense. You can expect him to play both ways there. But, Standley Lake, they're not the deepest team, but they got some talent over here. Liam Graham has all PMC potential. Boston Harris could put in some work. And so let's go ahead and look at the schedule coming up here in 2024. To start, they play Conifer. That's a very complete team here, who's built kind of similarly, but I think they're a lot deeper, so I think that's a loss. Then they play Wheat Ridge here. This Wheat Ridge defense is just not that good. I think they are able to beat them, but this could be a shootout for sure. Then they play Bear Creek. That's a loss. Air Academy, I think that's another loss. Skyline, they beat last season, and now Skyline's graduating Ramen Carson and some other players. I think that's another dub, but it could be a close one. Then they play Lutheran, which is a loss. Littleton, they should beat. Same with Hinckley. Kennedy, I think they should beat as well. And then I think they'll lose to Holy Family. But altogether, I have them going 5-5 with the window wins between 3 and 7. Standley Lake, they're moving down to 3A, but they still play 4A talent like Bear Creek, Air Academy, and Skyline. Not to mention some tough 3A games between Conifer, Lutheran, and Holy Family. I need to see how this team translates to this level, as they are a tough squad. I think Liam Graham will have an excellent year, as well as Boston Harris, which should surprise some teams. And so I think they're capable of some upsets and are a wild card. If they get to 500 and go 5-5, I think there's a good chance they make the playoffs. This is definitely a team that should get better as the season goes on, and will be a very different team from the beginning of the season to the start of the playoffs. So we'll see what happens for them. We know they have Liam Graham and Boston Harris, but can they build around them? We'll just have to see what happens here in the fall. All right, now let's go ahead and talk about Holy Family, who had a great season last year. Cody predicted them to go 7-3 with a window of wins between 6 and 8, and then mentioned their postseason struggles, which is, I think it's very well documented in the past here. But, let's talk about the regular season first in 2024. They went 9-1, finishing a game over the window of wins, so doing pretty good here. They would beat Frederick 28-8, and then this is where we really felt like Holy Family turned the page. They would upset Broomfield, the defending 4A state champions, 30-29 in a game that would shake up the state here and put the state on notice. They would then follow that up with a good 46-28 dub over Mountain View. Then they would go to Roosevelt here. Gideon was at this game. This was a close one, but unfortunately could not beat the defending 3A state champions and fell to them 34-26 in a close one. They would respond, though, with a win over Conifer 41-6, and then a close win over Lutheran 35-28. Then they would beat Northfield 23-9, Fort Morgan 49-7, Lincoln 63-0, Kennedy 49-8, and then Denver North 50-8, just dominating their league. Once they beat Lutheran, they were basically the league champions in this one. Now, in the playoffs, and sorry, that Denver North game was actually a playoff game. They would blow out Denver North 50-8. They would then beat Lewis Palmer 42-17. And then their first real test would actually be really against Thompson Valley, who they would squeak out a tough dub against 21-7. At state, they would go ahead and beat down Lutheran 33-8, a team that was already pretty beaten down and were without some players from the beginning of the season. By the end of the day, they just outperformed them, and a win is a win as they claim their first state championship in 19 years, the third one ever, but their first one in 3A, finally getting over that hump. Now, they do lose some key seniors here who contributed to that, including Rylan Cooney, who was an all-PMC quarterback, 3A MVP winner, and state champion. The undersized quarterback had an electric senior year, throwing for 2,812 yards, 25 touchdowns to 5 picks, while rushing for 816 yards and another 23 touchdowns. This isn't the first time or last time we will see an undersized dual-threat quarterback win it all. Briggs Wheatley of Fort Morgan actually did it as well. And I remember before the playoffs started thinking that Holy Family could have a Fort Morgan type run potentially. And that's what happened. And so losing a guy like Rylan Cooney, that's definitely tough. I don't think you replace that so easily, as he, combined for 48 touchdowns just on his own there. And so that's a tough loss. But they also lose starting running back Dominic Gabriel, who rushed for an additional 1,428 yards and 14 touchdowns and was their lead rusher. They lose their second receiver in Jackson Gabriel, who caught 39 receptions for 751 yards and 6 touchdowns. They lose their lead tackler in Braden Bach, who had 156 tackles, 6 tackles for loss, and was a machine. They lose Mark Molander, their second leading tackler at linebacker, who had 119 tackles and 2 picks. They lose 6'3" safety Connor Neely, who had 84 tackles and led the team with 5 interceptions. And altogether on defense, they lose about half their defense, 7 of their top 13 tacklers, but that does include 6 of their top tacklers from last season, so they lose some significant leadership there. So a lot of production being lost on offense and defense. But, Holy Family returned some weapons here, including Monte Samaras, who is their lead receiver with 40 receptions for 754 yards and 7 touchdowns. He can also play quarterback and could switch over for his senior year, but that would unfortunately take away another offensive weapon from whoever's at quarterback. He does a lot after the catches and is very useful in the receiver role here. But like I said, he's a good all-around athlete. He could get quarterback snaps. They also bring back Anderson Osborne. The tight end was their third leading receiver with 621 yards and 4 touchdowns on 31 receptions. On defense, he was an important two-way player for them, adding on another 25 tackles going into his senior year. Look for him to continue to produce. They also bring back Camden Austin, an incoming senior lineman who had 73 tackles and is one of the top tackle leaders out of the returning seniors. They bring back Anthony Scott, who will be a senior. He rushed for 223 yards and 5 touchdowns as their third leading rusher. He's going to take on a bigger role with so many big offensive producers gone. And with him having experience, I think if you are Holy Family, you feel good about that. And then last but not least, I want to mention Iker Alfaro, the incoming junior quarterback here. Look, the QB job in Holy Family is wide open, and there are a couple options, including putting Samaras in at quarterback. But in my opinion, Iker is someone who, well, we've known him for a minute. That's not an opinion, that's a fact. And we've seen him train with one of the most elite private QB trainers who have, develop the likes of quarterbacks like DJ Bordeaux, who's now in Georgia and has like 20 plus D1 offers. Beckham Kritza, who just committed to Penn State. Austin Majewski, who just committed to South Dakota. C.T. Worley, the quarterback over at Broomfield. And so he's trained with the best and he knows what greatness looks like. I think Eaker has a very similar game to Rylan Cooney, and so I think that could translate into this offense pretty well. Hopefully he gets a chance to compete, but that's definitely an option that Holy Family has for them without sacrificing Samaras, who would arguably be their best offensive weapon by putting him at quarterback. And so Holy Family still has some things to work with here. And in the past, they've always reloaded well, being the private school that they are. And so let's look at this schedule for 2024 and talk about this upcoming season. To start, they play Northridge, and although I think this will be a close one, I think defensively they have enough to win here, and offensively they're just bigger than them. So I think that is a dub, but defending Justin Dill, who's a great quarterback, he will be losing his star running back next to him. And so I think that makes the difference, as I think Holy Family should beat him. But then they play Roosevelt here. In Roosevelt, they do return some good players like a Noah Lucero. They add on a quarterback in Jackson Craig. I don't know if he'll play right away, but he's a very decent quarterback, very good quarterback for them. And then they have some other pieces all around. I think, unfortunately, that's a loss. To play Roosevelt that early on in the season just doesn't bode well for them, in my opinion, as they're still putting it together. But this could be a competitive game for sure. Then they play Lewis Palmer. Lewis Palmer loses a lot of pieces. I think that's a win. Getting them early on, that definitely benefits a Holy Family a little bit more, who's more established and is deeper, just honestly. Then they play Pueblo East. By this point, I think they'll be in a good spot. That should be a win. They then play Mead. This is a team we're going to talk about later on here. And I think by this point, Holy Family should be in a good spot here. I'm going to give them the win at home. But Mead is tough. They got some players like Griffin Kratos Chevelle over there, Grant Gordon, Christian Heiner at quarterback should probably take a step forward. They got some pieces over there. This is definitely a losable game. I'm going to favor them here. Then they play Littleton, Kennedy. Those are wins. Lutheran will be a tough game. I think that's one that they lose. Then they play Hinckley. They should beat them. And then Standley Lake. They could prove to be tough to play here at the end. That could definitely be a trap game, but I'm going to have them win it. So right now, I have Holy Family going 8-2, but I'm giving them a window of wins between 6 and 9 here. Look, they're losing a lot of solid production, but they have some pieces in place to be able to make a push here. We'll know what kind of team they are early on here, depending on how they play Northridge, Roosevelt, Lewis Palmer, Pueblo East, and Mead to start the season, which are all tough. And then they play Lutheran, which will probably be for that league championship. And so if they could find a quarterback to feed Osborne and Samaras, I think this offense could really cook, and the defense will come along. They've historically have figured it out as the season has went on. But honestly, just right now, I can't see them losing more than 5 games. I see them winning at least 6. If they don't, it's just a really tough year, to be honest with you. But they should win at least 6 and make the playoffs. And there's potential to, make some noise here still as they try to defend their title. But it just depends what they do personnel-wise. Moving on, though, let's go ahead and talk about Northridge. Last season, Cody predicted them to go 5-5 with the window of wins anywhere between 2 and 5, and that's exactly what happened. They went 5-5 here. Their season was interesting. They would start out really strong. They would start out 5-0, but then end the season on a 0-5 losing streak here. And so the 5 teams they beat to start was Gateway 37-0, Evergreen 48-6, Greeley Central 35-13, Greeley West 40-12, and Rangeview 31-21. But then they'd lose to Mountain View 34-14. Then they would lose to Roosevelt in kind of a close one here, 38-29. That's kind of a game that if they won, then that probably would have put them in the playoffs for sure. And then they dropped one to Thompson Valley, 43-14, Resurrection Christian, 42-14, and Severance, 41-18. Just barely missing out on the playoffs here. Like I said, started out really strong and then just kind of fell off near the end as they played some very tough teams. Now, let's talk about some graduating seniors, as they do have a couple, even though they were a very young team last season. But Raul Gallegos, at the start of the season, looked like an MVP candidate, but still had an excellent senior year, rushing for 1,010 yards and 18 touchdowns. Also had 64 tackles and 2 picks on defense. He will be missed. They also graduate Braden Asmus here. The speedster was their lead receiver with 43 receptions for 790 yards and 7 touchdowns. Also had 18 tackles and a pick on defense. And then they lose Caden Brink as well, their third leading receiver, with 14 receptions for 214 yards and 5 touchdowns, also adding on 33 tackles on defense. Altogether, they lose those players on offense, their lead rusher and 2 of their top 3 receivers, but they lose just a little bit less than half their defense. 5 of their top 13 tacklers, but only 3 of their top 10 tacklers are graduating, so they do return a very experienced defense, and they return some interesting pieces on that side of the ball, on the offensive side of the ball as well. And so let's talk about it, starting with Justin Thill. The incoming senior quarterback had a solid first year starting, throwing for 1,545 yards, 15 touchdowns to 13 picks, but rushed for 197 yards and 2 touchdowns. He definitely needs to clean up the turnovers, but him returning is huge for this offense. They're going to lean on him a lot, especially considering that they are losing their starting running back and a couple receivers, and so we'll really see what he's made of going into his senior year. But, the film looks really good, and he could be a top player for them moving forward. They also bring back A.J. Evans, the 6'4", 225-pound linebacker defensive end, had 57 tackles and 2 tackles for loss. He should be returning with an experienced defense. They return Wyatt Hill, an incoming junior who led in interceptions with 3 while having 24 tackles. They also bring back incoming junior receiver Alexander Irizarry, I want to say. Excuse me if I'm saying that wrong, but he had 19 receptions and 223 yards. He could potentially step up as a primary receiving option. They also bring back Sage Olsen, who had 16 receptions for 159 yards and 2 touchdowns. That's another guy who should contribute a little bit more. And then they have some solid size on this line between Luis Morales, Isaac Bearden, Darian Chambers, Dallin Purcell, and Brandon Swift. This is definitely not a pushover line for Northridge. And so with all that being said, they bring back an experienced defense, they bring back a quarterback who's talented, and they bring back some size up front. Even though they lose some production, there's going to be some of that you could still make with what they have. And so to start, they play Holy Family. I think that's a tough squad to play right here at the beginning, especially when you're trying to figure out your offensive production. And, they have so many weapons over there. If the defense could stand tall, then, they could definitely win this game. But that's a tough one to win. I'm going to call it a loss for now. Then they play Glenwood Springs next. I think this is a great game to schedule here, as I think this is where they'll be the most vulnerable, since they are losing a lot more than Northridge. And so I do think they beat Glenwood Springs. Then they play Greeley West. That should be a dub. Following that, they play Green Mountain. Green Mountain's going to be tough. Although they lose a lot, they do return a lot of good players, including 2 key linebackers, a big offensive line again, some good athletes, and then the replacement coach in Rankin is extremely experienced and he's a good coach, and so I think he's still going to be able to get something out of this Green Mountain team. That's a tough squad to beat. Unfortunately, I think that's a loss. Then they play Thompson Valley. I think this could definitely be a winnable game. Thompson Valley's lack of offensive firepower concerns me, but their defense is still going to be pretty solid here. They're going to have some big size, some good size up front, and that could be enough to disrupt the Northridge team that may not have established offensive talent going into this one. They play a really tough first 5 games. It's a little bit different. Holy Family, Glenwood Springs, Green Mountain, Thompson Valley, that's tough for sure. And so in those 5 games, you kind of hope that they find some sort of confidence booster, for their offensive athletes, because that is where they are the most inexperienced at. And obviously Greeley West, I think that's a game where you could find a lot of that, but if you could find that in some of these other games, that could go a long way for them. But after that, They play Greeley Central, who we'll talk about later. I think they beat them. But then they play Windsor. That's a really big team up front, who's moving down from 4A. I think that's a loss, honestly. Plus, they have a lot of firepower, too. Windsor should be very good this season. I do think that's a loss. Then they play Mead. This is a tough game here, but they get to play them at home. I think they can beat this team, so I'm going to call it a win. And then Niwot and Timnath are wins as well. But altogether, I have Northridge going 6-4 with a window of wins between 4 and 7. Look, this team has a big enough line, a solid defense led by a stud, and a great quarterback. I think they could really take a step forward if the receivers step up and help him out. I think the difference between them getting to 500 and getting over 500 and making the playoffs will be those offensive playmakers who absolutely need to step up. And they play a tough schedule. Like, there are some really tough playoff teams here. I'm looking at Mead, Windsor, Thompson Valley, Green Mountain, Holy Family, Glenwood Springs, I think, is a fringe playoff team as well, kind of in that same spot as Northridge. They're going to have to win a couple of these games for sure to make the playoffs here, or they're going to be left out, just out again. And so we'll see what happens, but it should be a promising season for Northridge going into 2024. Okay, so up next, we're going to stay in Greeley, and we're going to talk about Greeley Central, who will be moving down from 4A to 3A. But before we talk about that and this next season, let's talk about last season here in 2023. Cody predicted them to go 3-7 with a window of wins between 2 and 4, and they overachieved, going 4-6 in the regular season, just barely missing out on the playoffs. Against Niwot, it didn't start out great. They lost to them 14-7, and this is a team they've lost to by one score for like 3 straight years in a row. It's kind of weird, but a tough loss there to get started. But then I saw them against Cheyenne Mountain, where they got a big dub here against a solid team, winning 41-21. A lot of their ceiling was revealed, I feel like, in this game, and it restored some faith in this new coaching staff, so you absolutely love to see that win. Then they drop one to Northridge, as expected, 35-13, before bouncing back with a good win over Palmer, 35-20. They then lose to Loveland, 63-19, Windsor, 57. And then they would play Greeley West in this rivalry game, and this one just got away from them. They lose to them 10-7, a very winnable game for them, honestly, and that just honestly was tough. Then they lose to Grand Junction Central 29-7, but then turn it around these last two games, beating Silver Creek 40-33 and beating Skyline 21-20. It's been a while since Greeley Central has won this many games, and honestly, there was a good chance that they could have won 6 games, and if they did, I think they could have made the playoffs here and snuck in, especially with the strength of schedule. But unfortunately, losing that close one to Niwot 14-7 and Greeley West 10-7 really held them back from making the playoffs. So a tough season for them, but it is a new coaching staff, right? You do gotta love what you saw out of them playing up in 4A there. Now they move down to 3A, but they will be without these seniors, including 4-year varsity quarterback starter Jano Trujillo. He leaves Greeley Central better than he left it, honestly, in his senior year, threw for 823 yards, 10 touchdowns to 5 picks. I think he was a good quarterback, but he had 2 head coaches, and it was just a tough deal for him. He also started during the pandemic, and so unfortunately, if he just had this coaching staff for one more year, then he really could have turned up in another season. But he will be graduating from Central and moving on to play college ball now. They also graduate Martin Mendoza. Only played 1 year of football, but he made an immediate impact, being their lead receiver with 416 yards, 6 touchdowns on 27 receptions, while rushing for 425 yards and an additional 2 touchdowns as their second leading rusher. And then on defense, also having 76 tackles and 2 picks. He did it all for them and was big time. They also lose Isaiah Asensio. The fullback had a pretty nice season, rushing for 489 yards, while tagging on 28 tackles and 2 sacks on defense. They also graduate Jaden Anzuris. He was their lead tackler with 109 tackles and was super active on the defensive side of the ball. But altogether, on the defensive side, they graduate 7 of their top 13 tacklers, but all 7 of those tacklers were top 10 tacklers for them last season, which is tough as they just lose a lot on both sides of the ball here. But they are not without some key players here. Let's talk about it, starting with their star running back, Carlos Cardoza. The incoming senior running back broke out onto the scene last season, rushing for 1,054 yards and 9 touchdowns, while catching 10 receptions for 139 yards and 2 touchdowns. I got to witness his breakout game, his arguably best game of the season, where he rushed for 242 yards and 1 touchdown on a pretty solid Cheyenne Mountain defense. And so now that they move down to 3A, you should see some slightly easier fronts here and there, but you should definitely expect to meet more stacked boxes as you have some defenses that are better coached, in my opinion, there for sure. They also bring back Patrick Lesnicki. The incoming senior was their second leading tackler with 88 tackles, 12 tackles for loss, and led with sacks with 4. He's going to have to step up on this defense with them losing so many starters. And on that defense, just talked about one more player. That's Diego Stripe. He was their third leading tackler with 81 tackles, 7 tackles for loss, and 3 picks. Him and Lesnicki will be burdened with the task of helping this team pick up where they left off on defense. And so they bring back some defensive players. They bring back a very good player in Cardoza, and they move down to 3A. On paper, they should potentially do better. This is what I have them doing. Let's go ahead and look at this 2024 fall season here. I will say their schedule is incomplete as of July 8th. Only 6 games scheduled here. Or I guess 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, 6 games scheduled here. I do know of one more game that they'll play because it's a league game. So I have 7 games here for them. But currently, they're going to play Mountain View to start. That's a very underrated team. I think that's a loss as they do bring back some good size up front, which I think is just going to be a mismatch for Central. Then they play Adams City. That should definitely be a win. Following that, they play Northridge. I think that is a loss, unfortunately, still. Same with Mead. I think that's another loss. They're just bigger up front. Timnath, though, I do think they could win. They do lose a lot of players, so I think that's a winnable game. And then they play Windsor. That's their last scheduled game here. That's a very tough team here. I think that's a loss. And then following that, they should play Niwot at some point. While they haven't beat them yet, I do think that's a very beatable team. So I'm going to call that a win. So right now, with their 7 games that I know that they'll play, I have them going 3-4 with a window of wins anywhere between 2 and 5 here. I think Greeley Central is going in the right direction after their first-year head coach got them close to 500, and that's the closest they've been in I feel like almost a decade. I think Cardoza is a very special player and will do a lot for that team, but in 3A you need to have multiple threats to be a consistent winner. Other players need to step up for Greeley Central for them to make the playoffs or for them to get to 500 here. So we'll see what happens. I do think that it could be a hopeful year for Central. Cardoza, he's a great ball player over there. And then they got some other pieces, but they're going to need a little bit more firepower on both sides of the ball to make the playoffs. We'll just have to see what happens. All right, now up next, we're going to talk about Mead. Last season, Cody predicted them to have a window of wins anywhere between 3 and 5, but he predicted them going 5-5 here, and they would go 5-5, just making the playoffs barely. But let's talk about that season. To start, they lost a close one to Windsor 10-7. That would have been a huge win for them to get their season going, but that's a tough first loss to start. Then they'd lose to Lutheran 35-15. Bounce back with a big win over Severance 35-31. That isn't as close as that game was, as they did kind of storm back at the end there. Then they'd lose to Durango 30-16, Green Mountain 44-7, but win a tough game against George Washington 21-7, beat Denver North in another tough one 21-14, beat Niwot 14-3, and then lose a tough one to Frederick 23-17. But they would make the playoffs here by beating Riverdale Ridge in a crazy 6 7-3 game to go ahead and make it where they would face off with Durango, who they'd travel to Durango for this game. And I mean, this is a team they played in Durango just a season or two ago, and so they are very prepared in playing them. And they would go ahead, play them, and unfortunately lose a close one, 31-27, as Mead kind of picked it up at the end of this season, having a solid year. Now, let's talk about some seniors. They're graduating. They were a relatively young team last season, so there's not too many. But they graduate Cole Michaelis. He was their lead running back with 491 rushing yards and 5 rushing touchdowns. They lose Ethan Scallon. He was their second lead receiver with 25 receptions, 300 yards, and 3 touchdowns. They lose Ty Olson, who was their fourth receiver with 21 receptions, 201 yards, and 2 touchdowns. And then they graduate Cody McDonald, who was a senior with the most tackles with 64 from his safety spot. Altogether, I mean, most of the damage here, I feel like, is on the defensive side, I would say. They lose 5 of their top 13 tacklers, 3 of their top 10 tacklers, so not too bad here. They bring back the majority of this team on both sides of the ball. Now let's talk about the key players, starting with their quarterback, Christian Heiner. In his first year starting, the incoming senior threw for 1,207 yards, 8 touchdowns to 11 picks, but rushed for 205 yards and 5 touchdowns. Well, it wasn't bad at all. He definitely needs to clean up some of these turnovers, as it did end up costing them in some games. Specifically, I'm looking at the Windsor game and Frederick game, which were all pretty much one-score losses there, where you had turnovers. Plain and simple, the efficiency needs to go up here, and I think it will. Mead is a well-coached enough squad, and I think Heiner, he's going to develop, and that should put them in a spot to win a little bit more, but he's a solid quarterback for them. They also bring back Edison Burke. The incoming senior was their lead receiver from last season with 32 receptions, 385 yards, and 2 touchdowns, so also rushing for 121 yards. If Heiner takes a step forward, I think so will Burke. They bring back Ryan St. Aubin, the incoming junior, did it all as their second lead receiver with 26 receptions for 254 yards and a touchdown, while also rushing for 158 yards and a touchdown. He could potentially be in line for more carries at running back, especially considering who that team is losing, and I think they could definitely replace some of that production and get a little bit more with St. Aubin being so versatile over there and hopefully taking another step forward. Now on defense, they bring back Josh Gonsalves, I want to say. Excuse me if I'm saying that wrong, but the incoming junior led the team with 100 tackles and 4 tackles for loss. While not the biggest linebacker, he has good speed and is a good tough tackler, so bringing him back will be huge. They also bring back Carter Woods, incoming junior linebacker, also undersized, but he had a great year, racking up 78 tackles and 4 sacks. But don't get it twisted, Mead has some size here that they are bringing back. Grant Gordon is one of them, the 6'2", 273-pound incoming senior. Plays center, defensive tackle. He will be returning. They also returned this stud here in Griffin Credo-Javel, I want to say. Excuse me if I'm saying that wrong. But the incoming junior defensive end / tight end is 6'2", 230 pounds, and last season as a sophomore racked up 42 tackles and 5.5 sacks, which he led the team in sacks last season. Going into his junior year, he could definitely take a leap forward and have a breakout season. And so with that being said, Mead has some size here, and that's going to be an issue for a lot of teams moving forward. Also combine the fact that Jason Klatt, their head coach, who has done a lot with what they've had these last couple of years, he will be returning. You could definitely expect this team as a whole to take a step forward and probably make the playoffs again and make a deeper run. But to start, they play Pueblo South. I think that's a really tough poll here. It could go either way, as they do get them at home, though. But for now, I'm going to call it a loss. This is a pretty tall task, as they bring back their big three of Piscata, Hurley, and Herrera at quarterback, running back, wide receiver. And so this defense is going to have to find a way to shut them down. And if they do, I think that says a lot of good things for them moving forward. But for now, I'm just going to play it safe and call it a loss. Don't get it twisted, though. It could go either way. Then they play Frederick. I think Frederick just has a lot of firepower here. I don't know if this defense is going to be good enough to stop them straight up, and so I'm going to give it to Frederick. But then they play Greeley West, Lewis Palmer. I think those are both teams that Mead could outshoot and shut down with their defense, so those are wins there. But following that, they play Holy Family. By this point in the season, I mean, it's halfway through the season, Holy Family should get their stuff figured out at quarterback. They have some weapons over there, and I don't know if that's the greatest matchup for them. Mead might have the size advantage, but at the end of the day, I just don't know if the offensive side of things for Mead is going to be able to overcome some of the offensive weapons and firepower that Holy Family has. So I'm going to call it a loss for now, but don't be surprised if they win this game. But then they play Timnath, Greeley Central. I think those are both wins there. They then play Northridge. I really kind of think that this is a game they could win. But Northridge does return a good defense. I think there's a good chance that could be more of a defensive matchup. So I'm going to give it to Northridge for now. I like their quarterback a little bit better, and that is the slight edge that I'm giving them there. Then they play Windsor. I think that's a loss. But then they play Niwot. I think that's a win. So right now I have Mead going 5-5, which I feel like is really conservative. Their window of wins is 4-7. Look, Mead has a solid team this year with playmakers all over. Heiner has a lot of potential and has some solid options around him. And then on defense, they're well coached, and they have a Griffin, Credit Chevelle to take up a lot of attention. Mead also has some size up front on both lines here. They just play some tough teams. Pueblo South has a lot of speed and versatility that is just tough to stop there. Frederick will be tough with Gavin, Ishmael, Burke, and Palma out there. Windsor, I think, could be a winnable game, but they return back Deacon Schmidt, which is a game changer. You know, and then Northridge, I think, should definitely be a winnable game here. But I think that one could really swing either way. But I will say this, if Mead gets over 500, then they're going to make the playoffs. If they get to 500, I think they make the playoffs again. I just got to see more from this offensive side. I'd like to see a little bit more production, a little bit more firepower out of there, and a bit more from Christian Heiner. If they could do all that, then I think Mead could potentially be some sort of dark horse moving forward. But either way, I do think this Mead team is a playoff team at the very least. They have a lot of talent. They're well coached. They'll find a way to get it done. I just don't know. I just don't know which tough games I feel like that they're going to win necessarily here. So we'll just have to see, you know, what happens. I'd love to be proven wrong because I do think this is a good program here. But it's going to be a little bit of a grind to get through this regular season. Moving on, though, we got Niwot. This one will be kind of shorter here. Cody predicted the record to be 3-7 with the window of wins between 2 and 5. They went exactly 3-7. They would beat Greeley Central 14-7, Thornton 29-14, Eagle Valley 29-15 while dropping the rest of their games. But they played some close ones like George Washington, who they lost to 34-33, Mead 14-3, Denver North 24-14, but just couldn't get over that hump. They also lost a close one to Skyview 16-14. Niwot has incomplete stats, so I really don't know what's going on. They also don't have like any film, so that's tough. I know they graduate their quarterback. They also graduate about 9 of their top 13 tacklers with the incomplete stats I have. So there's that. Key player-wise, they bring back Hayden Shaw. He's an incoming senior looking to be their main producer. The year before, he ran for 422 yards and 2 touchdowns in 8 games. Obviously, this season, I think he should see more touches. They also bring back Jonathan Lopez, the incoming junior lineman. Had 13 tackles listed in 3 games. Hopefully, he helps hold down that defense. So there you go there. Now, just looking at their schedule, I just don't see them winning a game. They play Thomas Jefferson, Centaurus, Skyview, Wheat Ridge, Windsor, Timnath, Northridge, Mead, Greeley Central. I think they go 0-9. I will give them a window of wins between 0 and 4. Look, I think this Niwot squad is facing a very down year. I'd be surprised if they win more than one game because of how devoid of talent they are. And on top of that, I just don't know what kind of team they are. There's no stats. There's no film. It's extremely frustrating. We've done this for way too long to care this much here. I think they're winnable games for them. is Skyview, Timnath. Let me see here. Centaurus. And I think that's really it. If they schedule another game, I guess there is potential for that one to be close. So there you go. But I mean, those are the 3 games I think they can win. You know, just looking based off of their history before. And if, you know, they schedule an easier game, then maybe that's another win. And so I think at most, maybe they win 4 games, but I'd be really surprised if they did. We'll just have to see what happens here in 2024. All right, now let's go ahead and talk about Glenwood Springs here. Last season, Cody predicted them to go 7-3 with a window of wins anywhere between 5 and 7. And they finished just below expectations. Well, Cody's predicted record, that is, they were still within the window of wins as they finished 5-5 on the season, going 500 there. And so here's how last season went. It would start out with a 3-game winning streak as Glenwood Springs would take care of Aspen 36-28, Grand Junction 44-10, and Conifer 26-8. They would then play Rifle, which was a game Cody went to, where they would lose a tough one, 22-20, a very winnable game there against a 2A team who would end up going to state in their classification. But the slide wouldn't stop there. They would lose to Basalt 30-12, Grand Junction Central 56-14, Durango 48-0, but would bounce back with a win over Summit 50-33 and beat Eagle Valley lose to Eagle Valley though 19-16 in another close one, kind of in a shocking one, but bounce back with a dub over Palisade 21-0 in what felt like an up and down season for them, for good reason though. They would make the playoffs, but unfortunately they would lose to Green Mountain 52-7. Also, it is worth saying that they did lose their head coach about mid-season or so after the Durango game, I believe. Allegedly, Hunter Holmes, their head coach, was fired/dismissed because he was said to be mistreating refs. There was also some drama with his father, who was an assistant coach and had a warrant out for his arrest back in Texas and Bexar County. And so they had to have an interim coach, which was Eric Bullock, who took over here. And so there are definitely some growing pains. That probably explains the Eagle Valley loss here, but was still able to get them to the playoffs, though. So there you go there. A very tumultuous season for Glenwood Springs, to say the least. But let's talk about some graduating seniors, starting with Joaquin Sandoval. The standout athlete will now be taking his talents to Wyoming. But for Glenwood Springs, he was a great athlete for them, playing 3 years on varsity, I believe, at least. And at quarterback, he passed for 764 yards, 5 touchdowns, and 5 picks, while rushing for 564 yards and 9 touchdowns. He was their second leading rusher and their lead passer. Also was an exceptional DB, racking up 73 tackles and a pick. They also graduated Max Bullock, who was going to play for Roaring Fork, and then they decided not to have a varsity team, and so he moved over to Glenwood Springs here. And so having covered him the last couple years, I really feel like I need to mention him, as he was a good athlete, and he did it all on offense as the backup quarterback, but on defense, that's where he made his mark, where he had 51 tackles, 3 sacks, and 2 picks. He was the lone bright spot for Roaring Fork for a while, so it was pretty cool to see him to at least make the playoffs for the first time in his career. So that is definitely fun, but they will be losing him, who was a good athlete for them. They also graduate Logan Shanks. He was their sack leader with 4, and also had 29 tackles. On the defensive side of the ball, they graduate 7 of their top 13 tacklers, 2 of their top 5 tacklers, which was Bullock and Sandoval, and 5 of their top 10 overall. That does include Bullock and Sandoval, by the way, which isn't the worst, so they lose about a half of their contributors on this defense. And then I do want to mention they also graduate Jake Croissant, the 6', 225-pound defensive tackle and offensive tackle, was a captain for them, and so he will be graduating as well. But let's talk about some key additions, starting with their head coach. They have hired Mike West to be their new head coach for this 2024 season. Played originally at Montrose back in the day before moving on to play for Western and then playing professionally overseas. He was also an assistant coach under Rocky Whitworth and Pat Engel for Glenwood Springs here back in 2012 to 2016. 17 with Whitworth, and then 18 with Angle. So he's very well known in the community. Now, this is a program that has had 4 head coaches since 2021, Angle, Thor Jensen, and then Holmes/Bullock this last year. So hopefully he could bring some stability to this program. And it does help that he brings back a stud of an athlete in incoming senior stud Mason Markovich, the 5'11", 221-pound running back/linebacker. Is just a freak of nature and can be due for a big-time MVP or all-PMC type season. He was their lead rusher with 1,090 yards and 10 touchdowns on 6.5 yards a carry. That also includes a massive 355-yard, 3-touchdown explosion against Summit on only 23 carries. And honestly, last season he only went over 20 carries twice, and both times he scored 3 touchdowns and rushed for 150 plus. On top of being their lead tackler on defense at linebacker with 87 tackles, 3 sacks, 2 picks, 2 forced fumbles. I mean, he's an absolute nasty linebacker, a thumper over there, and definitely a potential top 5 senior candidate at both running back and linebacker in the entire state of Colorado. One of the best players in the state, and so he will be probably the star of this team again. You could do a lot with Mason Markovich as he does enter his senior year. They do return Oliver Walls as well. The incoming senior was their second leading tackler to Markovich, racking up 79 tackles. He should help lead a solid defense. And then last but not least here, they do return Zach Bullock, I believe the brother of Max here, as I think he will stay over at Glenwood Springs, but he was their lead receiver with 26 receptions for 265 yards and a touchdown, while rushing for another 105, and then on defense having 68 tackles and 3 sacks, also forcing 3 fumbles from his outside linebacker spot. I think he's going to be key to this team, as I think he can be a good running mate with Markovich on both sides of the ball, and he does have some solid speed there. So if you're Glenwood Springs, you definitely have something to work with, and that should give you hope going into 2024. Now, let's look at the schedule and talk about it, though. To start, they play Summit here. I think this is a win. Summit, we're going to talk about later on in this episode, I believe, and they're just losing a lot. I just don't think that Summit is going to be that competitive right away with how many players they're losing. Obviously, Glenwood Springs is losing some players, but at least they have Markovich to lean on here. So I think that's a dub for Glenwood Springs. Following that, they play Northridge at home, which I think is big time. I think I want to go with Glenwood Springs here, but Northridge, they do have a bigger line. They have a quarterback, and I think that just means they could do a little bit more on offense than they can. They're also not losing their head coach, so got to go with Northridge there. Then they play Basalt here. Basalt, they do return a number of players that kind of tore up Glenwood Springs last year, so I think that's a loss. Same with George Washington here. George Washington returns a number of players. They got some size. They have a quarterback. I think that's another loss. They're really similarly built to Northridge, in my opinion. George Washington, that is. But then they play Conifer. This is a tough team that I think is going to run the ball between Wolonsky and Payer, but I think they have the players to stop that. I think this is a dub, but this really should be a good game. It could go either way, honestly. Then they play Eagle Valley. That should be a win. Rifle, they're losing a lot of players. We'll talk about them later this episode. I think that should be a win. Battle Mountain, if they have a varsity season, actually, that should definitely be a win. Steamboat Springs, I think that's another win right there. And then you play Palisade at the end of the season. That's a tough game. They return some good size, defenders, athletes everywhere. I think that is a loss, but it could be a winnable game if you have some other players develop to step up into place. We're not in the place, but alongside a Mason Markovich, Bullock, all these guys that I just talked about. And so altogether, I have Glenwood Springs going 6-4 with a window of wins anywhere between 3 and 7, a pretty wide window of wins. And look, this Glenwood Springs team has a lot of potential and could make a playoff push with the weapons they have. It will be telling to see what this new head coach does and if he can bring some stability, because this really is a team that can play. I think at the very least, they beat Eagle Valley, Battle Mountain, Steamboat Springs. Then I look at Summit, Basalt, Conifer, Rifle, and Palisade as games that can all swing their way if things go right, as in, they don't shoot themselves in the foot. And not all of these, but at least 4 or 5 if Markovich stays healthy. That is talking about that group of games there. And I think that's possible, but they need a Zach Bullock to step up as well as the defense to take a step forward. I'm really high on Mason Markovich. I mean, all of us on the podcast are. I think he legitimately could be one of the best players in all of Colorado, regardless of classification. So they have something to work with there. But you need a lot more from the rest of your group, and losing a guy like a Joaquin Sandoval who provided so much of a threat there at quarterback and DB, that's a tough one to lose. And so we'll see what happens for Glenwood Springs, and if they could, have some other players develop and take a step forward and break out here in 2024. All right, now let's go ahead and talk about Summit here. Last year, Cody predicted them to go 5-5 with a window of wins between 4 and 6. And you know what? They fell within that window of wins, going exactly 4 and 6. So they're just one game below what we predicted. Last season, here's how it went down. They got blown out by Basalt 28-0 to start, but then bounced back with a 21-0 win over Woodland Park, then lost to Thompson Valley 36-15, but then went on a 3-game winning streak, beating Conifer 24-10, Wheat Ridge 32-14, Lincoln 53-6. Then they dropped a close one to Durango here 26-21, arguably the game that could have put them in the playoffs there. And then they would lose to Palisade 44-6, Glenwood Springs 50-33, and then lose to Eagle Valley 36-35. That game probably for sure put them out of the playoffs. So there you go there. And this is all with a first-year head coach, Paul Lopez. And with that being said, let's talk about some seniors who will be graduating. And here's the thing that sucks. There's no defensive stats, and Summit is very much out there, so that's very unfortunate. So we're just going to talk about the offense here, starting with their quarterback Hank Shabbat, excuse me if I'm saying that wrong, but passed for 1,780 yards, 10 touchdowns to 5 picks, while rushing for 142 and a touchdown. Honestly, he was a solid stopgap quarterback for Summit there, had a solid season there and kind of kept things going. They also graduate Ben Elam, who's their lead rusher with 859 yards and 7 touchdowns. They graduate Jackson Archambault, one of their most dynamic athletes, who was second in rushing yards with 755 yards and 9 touchdowns, while also being their lead receiver with 70 receptions and 874 yards and 7 touchdowns. Just going crazy. So that's definitely a tough loss there. As well as Emilio Jane. He was their second leading receiver with 492 yards and 2 touchdowns. As Summit still passed the ball here, but I think they had some great athletes there in a quarterback, and I mean that's definitely big time, right? You can't complain about that. Defensively, I wish there was more. I felt like they had a up and down season, from holding Wheat Ridge and Conifer to like 10-14, Durango to only 26, and then allowing 36 to an Eagle Valley or 28 to a Basalt, which isn't that crazy, but still though, it is a little bit wild. 44 to Palisade is kind of crazy too. So I do not know where this defense is at, and there's also no film, so that's totally great. But I know there's one key player that you got to look out for Summit, and that is Henry Eslich here. He is one of the only players to have stats recorded for him, but in only 5 games, and in those games, he ran 15 times for 140 yards and 2 receptions for 38 yards. He's also a bigger athlete at 6'2", 210 for the incoming junior. So hopefully they build around him. I would assume they build around him moving forward, as he does seem like a solid athlete for Summit. And so going into year 2 with their head coach, let's talk about 2024 and this fall here. To start, they play Glenwood Springs, and I honestly don't love this right at the beginning of the year. I think this is just a straight-up loss. They bring back a lot. I don't know if this defense could stop a Mason Markovich, but I'm betting that they don't, considering Glenwood Springs dropped 50 on them last time. So there you go. But they also scored 30. But a lot of that offensive firepower is now gone, so I think that's definitely a red flag. But then they play Battle Mountain. That really should be a dub. But following that, they go play Canyon City. Canyon City has 2 big defensive ends, some players over there, and a solid running game. I think that is tough for them to stop, as this team really struggled against teams who ran the ball well. So I think that's a loss. Aspen, they return Henry Hurd. I don't know who's going to cover him, but I think that's a loss there. They should probably beat Steamboat Springs, though. Evergreen, Green Mountain, I'd even throw in Conifer, all losses. They could beat Skyview. I think I will have them beating Skyview, so that's a dub. And then I don't think they're beating Wheat Ridge again like that. I think that's a loss for sure. And so I have Summit going 3-7 with a window of wins between 2 and 5. Look, I'm really worried about this team. The lack of defensive stats is just very out of character and is just really concerning for me. On top of that, they lose some massive contributors on offense, and I don't think it's easy to just replace a guy like Jackson Archambault like that, or just kind of luck out and find your third quarterback who is extremely productive and whatnot. It's really hard to have good quarterbacks or develop good quarterbacks this many times in a row. So you kind of got to think eventually that luck runs out, right? And so on top of that, this defense also really just struggled last year. Even if they are graduating, most of them, that is inexperience, and I feel even worse about that. So we'll just have to see. I tried looking up film, wasn't super impressive, but I will say this, they should be Battle Mountain and Skyview, so they really shouldn't drop below 2 wins. Then after that, I think Steamboat Springs, they could beat, that's one of those teams that they could definitely beat there. But right now, it's just very far and in between. I don't have the most amount of confidence in them. But, who knows? If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. I would hope to be wrong, as this has been a solid 3A program, but we're just going to have to see what happens moving forward. Alright, so up next, let's talk about a team that is moving up to 3A this season, and that is Rifle. Last year, they played in 2A, and Cody predicted them to go 7-2 in 2A with a window of wins anywhere between 5 and 8. That is during the regular season. They went 8-1, still within the window of wins here. But let's go ahead and talk about last season and what happened, at least in that regular season to start. They would start as expected, beating Montezuma Cortez 47-6, and then beating Glenwood Springs 22-20. That was the game that Cody didn't think they would win, which I felt like is pretty fair. Honestly, that was still a pretty close game. Could have went either way, but that's a big win for Rifle. Then they played Delta and dropped that one 28-7, but bounced back with wins. I mean, they wouldn't lose again this regular season. They would bounce back and beat Brush 28-14, Moffat County 42-20, Basalt 55-27, Aspen 61-7, Grand Valley 49-7, Coal Ridge 54-0, just rattling off a whole bunch of wins to end the season. And at this point, we knew this would be a very strong team. I mean, their only loss was against a very good Delta team who was number 1 in our eyes. But in the first round, they would face off with Brush, and they would survive a little bit of a scare here, winning 21-14. But the scares wouldn't end there. They would move on to the second round and play University, and would barely beat them 35-28 in a thriller. And then kind of unexpectedly, they would face off with Eden in the semis, and that would be the biggest margin of victory, I believe, over a team in the playoffs, and that was Eden, where they beat them 24-15. So still kind of a close game, but definitely a little bit more in control of that one. Then they would go play Delta. Cody obviously went to that state championship and fall short 54-14. I believe Logan Gross got injured during that game, and that definitely changed a little bit of how that would have went. But unfortunately, still coming up short against Delta, who was the only team they lost to last season, who ended up winning state in 2A. Now, Let's talk about some graduating seniors here, as there are definitely a lot of players that they are losing. They're losing a lot of key players on top of that as well, including Logan Gross. Didn't make our All-PMC list as he narrowly missed out, but was voted our 2023 2A MVP in a season where he passed for 1,731 yards, 16 touchdowns to 10 picks, while rushing for 1,431 yards and 18 touchdowns. And then on defense, having 49 tackles and 8 interceptions, I believe leading the team in interceptions, just being an absolute beast. And obviously when he went out and wasn't playing, that was very noticeable for them, and so that's going to be a tough player to replace. I don't know if you just do that, like just replace him like that. It's going to take a couple players stepping up for them to replace that type of production. They also lose Sterling Cook. He was their lead receiver, with 39 receptions for 686 yards and 5 touchdowns, so also having 43 tackles and 6 picks on defense. They also graduate Jesus Martinez, their lead tackler, with 106 tackles. They graduate Troy Mattia. He was a DPOY Defensive Playmaker of the Year finalist and All-PMC defensive tackle, racking up 82 tackles, 20 tackles for loss, and 11 sacks, leading the team in sacks there. And just having monster games and being super productive, that's just a tough player to lose along with all these other guys. But altogether, defensively, they're losing a lot. 9 of their top 13 tacklers, that includes 7 of their top 10 tacklers. That's a good majority of that defense. That includes also their top 4 sack leaders and top 2 interception leaders. And then you also throw in that they lose their quarterback, who was their lead passer, I believe, lead rusher, and then your lead receiver. So a lot of production, and then you lose some linemen as well, like Troy Mattia. So a lot of production is being lost, but they do return some players, including Isaac Valencia for his senior year, where he was their second leading rusher and receiver last season. He rushed for 1,093 yards and 16 touchdowns, while catching 29 receptions for 346 yards and 3 touchdowns. He now looks to be the workhorse for this team, as they did lose their top dog on defense. He's going to have to contribute as well as last season. He did pretty solidly, contributing 52 tackles and 3 picks. He could definitely be an award candidate, whether it's MVP or OPOY, as he does have a lot of responsibility now on his shoulders. But it's not just him. They bring back Ryland Lane as well. The incoming junior athlete was a solid contributor for them, having 173 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns to go with 11 receptions for 204 yards. For Rifle to find success, they need to have a second scoring option, and Lane could be that next to Valencia. Lane was also one of their top tacklers with 63 tackles and 3 picks, so he's going to have to play both ways and play at hopefully an improved and higher level as well. And then last but not least, they also bring back Kevin Arvizo, one of the few returners on the defense last year, who had 51 tackles and 2 tackles for loss before, unfortunately, his season ended early after the Brush game. I think that's their first, I want to say their first playoff game. So, not the regular season game. So, there you go there. Rifle, they have a good coaching staff, I would say. I like their coaching staff. On top of that, they do return some key pieces on the offensive side of the ball here. And really, actually, I should say they return key two-way players, two-way athletes, because they're very good on both ends. And so they're going to be asked, a lot's going to be asked out of them, I think. But to start, they play Grand Junction. I feel like most years this is a winnable game, but it is at Grand Junction right at the beginning of the season. I think that's a loss. But then they play Basalt. I think they beat them. Following that is Delta. They do have a new head coach, but Ty Reed is still there. And honestly, as long as Ty Reed is there, I think they have the potential to be a versatile offense. So I think that's a loss. Then they play Roosevelt. That's a tough team to play here. That's a loss. University, I think, is probably a loss. I'm really nervous about how this defense would handle Brevin Doss, who's a great athlete over there. And even then, last season, I felt like they struggled stopping him. Then they play Palisade. I think now it's Palisade's year. They're bigger up front. They have more experience. They have players. We're going to talk about them later on in this episode. I just don't think that's a win. Glenwood Springs, I think unfortunately last season was a close game. This season, even though Glenwood Springs do lose some players, I just like what they bring back. They still got to stop Mason Markovich, and I don't know if a depleted defense could do that. But then they play Eagle Valley, Battle Mountain, and Steamboat Springs, and those should all be wins here. And so right now, I have Rifle going 4-6 in 3A with a window of wins anywhere between 3 and 5. They're losing some serious talent, and on top of that, they're moving up to 3A, which is always competitive. And so it's going to be tougher for them, and I just think it's very realistic that they'll finish under 500 for sure, but they'll have at least 3 wins, I think, in Eagle Valley, Battle Mountain, and Steamboat Springs. I think those are almost guaranteed at that point. I'm relatively confident that they also beat Basalt as well, but there's a chance that that could go the other way. We'll just have to see. And then the rest of these matchups are just not favorable. I mean, they play a lot of playoff teams, whether it's 2A playoff teams or 3A playoff teams. And, this is a defense that is unproven. This is an offense that, showed a lot of production last season, but when Logan Gross didn't play, it was pretty noticeable, right, compared to that top tier competition. So I just need to see a little bit more from this team and just see what happens. This season I think could be a little bit of a rebuilding year, despite having pieces in a Valencia, in a Lane, but who knows? I'm open to being wrong. But I'm still excited to see what happens to Rifle moving forward as they move up to play in 3A. All right, now up next, we're going to talk about Wheat Ridge. Cody predicted them to go 1-9 with the window of wins between 1 and 3, and they exceeded expectations. They went 4-6, improving a pretty solid amount and proving Cody wrong. I think they showed a lot of grit here, but let's talk about last season. To start, they lost a close one to Fort Lupton, 24-22. That's definitely a pretty winnable game there, but I understand. Fort Lupton was also better than I thought they would be. They then lose to Thomas Jefferson 39-7, Denver North 41-21, would bounce back with a dub over St. Creek 26-8, but then would lose to Summit 32-14, Conifer 35-0, would bounce back with a very close win over Skyview 28-25 before losing to Green Mountain 50-0, but would end the season on a 2-game winning streak, beating Evergreen 35-14 and Littleton 57-22. Now, they don't have a lot of seniors graduating, but we'll still talk about some of them, including Trey Perkins. He was their lead running back with 320 yards and 2 touchdowns on only 64 carries. They also graduate Frank Erickson, who's their second lead receiver with 21 receptions for 275 yards and 2 touchdowns. Was also one of their top tacklers with 103 tackles and a pick. And then they graduate Nick Dalton, who is their third lead receiver with 22 receptions, 254 yards, and 3 touchdowns, while also having 46 tackles. They only graduate 4 of their top 13 tacklers, but 3 of those tacklers are in their top 5, or at least last season they were. And then offensive production-wise, those are really the only offensive producers they are losing, significant ones that they are losing, as they do bring back the majority of this team here. I think that's worth saying. But I want to start with this solid offensive line with incoming seniors like Xavier Edwards, who's tough, 6'5", 315, Xavier Brown, 5'10", 220, Jaden Rodriguez, 6'3", 240. They got some size up front here. I think that's going to help them out a lot. They also return a star, an absolute stud in Bennett Wilkes, a 6'1", 196-pound receiver / cornerback. I believe just got his first D1 offer to Northern Colorado. Sco Bears, by the way, and for good reason. He is the star of this team, led them in receptions with, led them as a receiver with 1,070 yards, 7 touchdowns on 79 receptions, also adding on 153 rushing yards and 4 touchdowns on only 24 carries. He was an all-PMC wide receiver. On defense, he also added on another 29 tackles and 5 pass deflections. He is pretty irreplaceable for this team, and if they win, it's partially because of him, for sure. But he is no doubt one of the best players in the state, a lot like what Mason Markovich was, or / is, for Glenwood Springs right now. but they also bring back their quarterback, Isaac McCune here. The incoming senior quarterback passed for 1,808 yards, 14 touchdowns and 10 picks while rushing for 337 yards and 2 touchdowns. He proved last year that he is more than good enough to play quarterback for this team, and honestly should be looking to take a step forward as a more efficient passer, have those interceptions go down a little bit here. But regardless, with Wilkes coming back, he has the chance to form one of the best quarterback wide receiver duos in the state, while he is also a rushing threat as well. So that's a great base to work with the wide receiver and quarterback. But on defense, it gets better. Not only do they return the majority of the defense, but they return two bigger-bodied linebackers in Angel Bueno. That incoming senior is 6'2", 210, running back / linebacker. And running back ran for 175 yards and 3 touchdowns on only 29 carries. And then on defense was the tackle leader with 138 tackles, 7 tackles for loss here. Could definitely provide a bit more on offense. I expect him to get a couple more carries, especially with Perkins gone here. But I expect him to also be a big part of this defense, an important part of this defense. On top of that, they also returned Devin Castillo, the 5'11", 210-pound running back / linebacker, built a lot like Bueno. They both do a lot of the same. He got the majority of the carries, though, and ran for 206 yards and 3 touchdowns, while never going for more than 12 yards in a season. He's a big-body bruiser at back that they need to rotate out with Bueno. On defense, he also collected 94 tackles as one of their top tacklers. And so Devin Castillo and Angel Bueno will definitely be relied on a lot to help lead a relatively experienced Wheat Ridge defense that hopefully should take a step forward while they do return the key parts, the core of their offense as well. And so Wheat Ridge is bringing back the majority of the squad. I believe this is let me just make sure I am correct here, year 3 for their head coach, Brandon Wilkes. So there's some continuity going into this season, which I think should be a good one for them. To start, they play Standley Lake, and let's talk about 2024, by the way. But to start, they play Standley Lake. I think that's a win right there. Standley Lake, they have Liam Graham, who could run the ball, but I do trust this defense to find a way to stop them, while the offense has to go to work as well, put pressure on Standley Lake to score on every drive. I think they could do that, plus they're bigger up front too. So there you go. Then they play Hayes. That's an out-of-state team. They went 7-3 in Kansas, and they're a pretty solid squad. I'm just going to play it safe and say they lose this game. But who knows? Maybe they beat them. They also play them at home, which is exciting. But moving on, they play Niwot, Middle Park. Those should both be wins there. They then play Pomona here. Pomona, they got some good athletes over there. This is where I worry a little bit about the defense. I think this is going to be a close game here. But if this defense could stand tall and not allow them to score more than 4 scores, I think they win this game, as they do have some very well-coached DBs out there, so I wouldn't exactly love for this to get into a shootout. Either way, I think this is going to be a close game. I'm going to lean towards Pomona, though. Yeah, I'll lean towards Pomona for now. And then they play Green Mountain. Even though they're losing a lot, I mean, we just talked about them earlier on this episode, I think that is probably a loss. They return 2 talented linebackers. They still have some good size and some key players all around. That's a tough one to win. If they do win it, that's big time. But I don't know if they're quite there yet, so that's a loss. But then I have them beating Conifer, Skyview, Evergreen, Summit pretty easily. I really don't see them losing to any of those teams. So right now, I have them going 7-3, which even then feels a little conservative. But with the window of wins between 5 and 8, this Wheat Ridge team is on the verge of figuring it out. Like I said, Brandon Wilkes entering his 3rd season as head coach, and his squad has gotten better every single year. I think this is the year they could make a jump. McCune should be better, and I think even with him losing other players, returning Bennett is really all you can ask for. On top of that, that just puts more pressure on McCune to be better, which I think he's capable of, and could potentially run a little bit more. And then on defense, I like the talent they bring back, and in addition, I really like the line that they have. The teams that might flip are Conifer and Evergreen, I guess, as far as losses go. I'm more concerned about Conifer than Evergreen. Conifer, they have 2 good running backs. I don't know. I could see a universe where the defense struggles with that against the run. But like I said, still leaning towards the Wheat Ridge. And then Evergreen, I mean, I don't know. It's rare that Evergreen has 2 really bad seasons in a row, so maybe that does flip. But in terms of wins that could flip, I do think they could beat a Hayes squad. I do think they could beat Pomona, but I am leaning the other way, just barely though. Either way, Wheat Ridge should make the playoffs and could definitely make a run. Now, whether they make a run or not, I think will depend how they perform, or at least it'll be very telling on, you know, what type of team this is, depending on how they perform against a Green Mountain, against a Pomona as well. I think if they are for real, then they beat those teams and maybe even blow them out as well. But, you know, it's been a long time coming for Wheat Ridge, so we're really happy that, you know, they're improving and getting better season by season. So we're definitely looking forward to this upcoming year here, where it should get really interesting in 3A if Wheat Ridge could be who I think they could be. Moving on, though, we have our last team here, but definitely not least, and that is Palisade. Last season, Cody did predict them to go 2-8, though, with the window of wins between 2 and 4, and they did a little bit better, going 3-7. But let's just go down the line, go down their schedule from last season. To start, they played Roosevelt, which is not a favorable game, and they lost that one 49-6. They then played Grand Junction Central, losing 28-7. Delta 35-10 was a loss. Montrose was a 42-0 loss. Golden a 27-12 loss. So they started on a 5-game losing streak. Really tough schedule to start. But then they'd go on a 3-game winning streak, beating Evergreen 38-0, Eagle Valley in a very close one, 21-16, and then Summit 44-6. They will then lose a relatively close one to Durango 19-0 and Glenwood Springs 21-0. I know those are 3-score games, but you know, if for some reason they flipped those, I think that definitely would have been their ticket to the playoffs. Now let's talk about the seniors graduating, because there's not that many. I only had 3 that I could find. They graduate 2 of their top 13 tacklers in Marcus Royster and Julian Tautua. Royster, he was their only other top tackler graduating from the safety spot, where he had 31 tackles and 2 picks. Tautua, he was a 6-foot, 245-pound defensive end who had 47 tackles, 8 tackles for loss. He will be graduating. And then on the offensive side, they graduate Caleb Wells, who was their second leading rusher with 518 yards and 6 touchdowns. Other than that, everyone comes back for Palisade, including Keaton Everett. The incoming senior quarterback passed for 199 yards, 2 touchdowns to 8 picks, but was utilized obviously as a rusher with 774 yards and 4 touchdowns, being their lead rusher. Going to their senior year, I assume they're going to lean on him again to help lead this offense. Speaking of offense, they also returned Caleb Johnson, their 6-foot, 210-pound running back, was their third leading rusher with 504 yards and 5 touchdowns, while being one of their top tacklers with 49 tackles. For this team to get better and potentially be a contender and make the playoffs, he needs to take a step forward, which I think he can. They also bring back Easton Embry, who was an all-PMC quarterback for us last season, where he had 39 tackles and a team-high 5 picks and 10 pass deflections. He's going to be an important part of that secondary as a senior. They also bring back Caleb Reed, another senior who had 81 tackles, 3 sacks, and is just one of the fastest players on this team. Could definitely expect a big senior season out of him. And then they also bring back Vincent Johnston. The incoming senior was an all-PMC interior offensive lineman, standing at 6'4", 285 pounds, is an absolute monster helping out this rushing attack. And then on defense, he also had 45 tackles and 6 tackles for loss. He is an underrated lineman and could be due for a big senior season that should hopefully see him get some college offers, as he does have that D1 size. So you got some good players for Palisade. Gotta remember that they run the ball a lot, so having that size up front is important. Having producers in this offense who have experience is important, as you could pretty much always expect them all to take a step forward. And then defensively, you pretty much return everyone, and so you gotta feel good about this team. But looking into this schedule here to start, they play Delta, and as of today, they play them at 8 p.m., which is kind of crazy here on the 30th. But I really think that is a win. Delta, they're losing some key pieces like a Tucker Johnson, just to say, and a couple other great athletes. I think Palisade early on could go ahead and take advantage of some of that potential chaos as they figure out how to replace some of those players that they are losing in those spots, and I think they win it straight up. So I think they beat Delta. Then they play Montrose. I don't think they beat Montrose just yet, so I think that's a loss. It's also at Montrose. Then they play Resurrection Christian. They should beat them. They play Durango following that. That's without Tyler Harms. They do return their 2 receivers, but even then, last season, that was a pretty competitive game. I think they beat him this year. Then they play Grand Junction Central, Battle Mountain. Those should all be wins. Rifle, I think that should be a win. They have a defense that could stop in Isaac Valencia. Steamboat Springs, Eagle Valley, those should be wins. And then they play Glenwood Springs. That'll be one of their tougher games for sure. They're going to have to find a way to stop Markovich, but by this point, it may not even matter. I'm still going to lean towards Palisade as I feel like they are the more complete team returning who they return. And so right now, I have Palisade going 9-1 with the window of wins between 6 and 9. I really like the defense that Palisade returns here. They return a lot of size and speed mixed with experience, returning that majority of their contributors on defense. And I think that's always a good thing when you do that. As well as having, great athletic ability and talent. But Palisade historically has been good on defense and have punished teams with a dominating run game. Offense is probably my biggest concern, as I need them to be a little bit more explosive and dangerous. All those athletes need to take a step forward for me, but don't get it twisted. This Palisade team is built around the success of the defense. I think as of right now, I do have them potentially losing against a Delta, whereas Christian and Durango, but I still favor them in those games. The only game I really don't think they can beat or win is probably the Montrose game, but capability-wise, defensively, I really think they could beat all these teams here, as Palisade should be due for a good season. They had a down season last year, had a lot of young talent. Going into this next season, you got a lot of experience. For sure, you got a lot of experience, so you should feel good about this team if you are Palisade going into 2024, at least compared to other teams who either don't have enough talent or don't have the experience. But there you go there. That'll wrap up this episode of the Playmakers Corner podcast. 16 teams, a lot of teams. I'm not going to do a review over the predictions here like I usually do, but I think there was only one team that we were wrong about, that Cody was technically wrong about. So that's pretty much it there. The rest were either in the window of wins, or we predicted the record correctly, or there were only one game outside of the window of wins. So still got to feel good about that. But 3A is going to be super exciting. I look forward to covering it in the fall. It's always my favorite classification, so I'm super excited to get to cover a lot of it during the regular season and the playoffs, which is going to prove to be very interesting here. Obviously, there's a lot more 3A programs that we got to do previews for. That'll be distributed among Cody, Gino, Gideon, so make sure you tune in for those. And to tune in for those, you got to follow us on social media at Playmakers Corner. Show some love there. Or, subscribe, like, comment, whatever, on whatever listening device or platform that you're listening to this podcast on. We really appreciate all that love. But until then, we will catch you later.